They say time moves slower in rescue shelters than anywhere else in the world. Each minute stretches longer, pulled taut by the wind weaving through rusted bars, by quiet eyes following unfamiliar footsteps, and by the silent questions that are never answered. For Orion, 6 years wasn't just 6 winters gone. It was over 2,000 dawns, passing quietly behind a wire mesh window. Orion was a German shepherd of sturdy build, tall stature, and a coat of black mixed with faded brown that had begun to gray around the eyes. No one knew his exact birth date. The only thing on record was the morning he was brought in, a windless autumn day from a remote northern rescue outpost, accompanied by a note. Found wandering in accident zone, no owner claimed. Back then, Orion was a young dog, just around 2 years old, strong in frame, his eyes bright like sunlight catching steel. Time moved forward. Dogs came, and dogs left. People arrived, pointing at the smaller ones, the gentler ones, the ones with less history, and Orion stayed. No one came for him. No name was ever called. The shelter log eventually added 2 words, unknown identity. But Orion was not nameless. He walked with the slow grace of an old soldier who had once stood guard over something sacred. There was a stillness in his gaze. Not sadness, not anger, just presence. The kind of presence that made even the youngest volunteers pause, just for a second, before moving on. For 6 years, Orion lived in kennel number 27, tucked at the far end of a long hallway. Every day when staff came to clean or feed, he would rise, step forward to the kennel gate, and sit tall, ears erect, back straight. No lunging, no retreat. He didn't need to be noticed. Perhaps deep down he knew the one he was waiting for wouldn't need to be convinced. In dry afternoons, the sun would pierce through the metal mesh and settle on his fur in a golden hush. And during those moments, Orion wouldn't look toward the gate. He would stare into the open space between the kennels, not at anyone in particular, but maybe someone once stood there. And in that gaze, people often saw something hard to name. Not simple hope, not quite sorrow, but the echo of an unspoken promise. A meeting that had never been scheduled, yet somehow still awaited. Orion wasn't the first dog visitors saw. His kennel wasn't near the entrance. He wasn't on the featured for adoption board. But somehow those who walked the entire hallway always stopped, even if only for a heartbeat, when his eyes met theirs. He didn't leap, didn't scratch, didn't bark in a frenzy like the others. He simply sat there, tall, still, silent. At dawn, before sunlight kissed the cold cement floor, Orion was already awake. He'd approach the mesh quietly, sitting at attention, ears alert, eyes focused on the far end of the corridor. He wasn't searching. He wasn't hoping. He was watching. And somehow the way he watched made you feel that he expected nothing, yet missed nothing. The staff often joked, "Orion isn't a stray, he's a gatekeeper." Maybe it was because he never felt out of place. Maybe it was that posture, upright, unyielding, not like a dog begging to be saved, but like a guardian quietly measuring the world. Sometimes children came to the shelter with their parents. Most were drawn to the playful puppies, or the ones that licked their fingers through the wire. But now and then, one child would circle back and stop in front of Orion. Some would whisper things through the fence, tiny hands reaching out. Orion wouldn't move, wouldn't look away. But for those who needed to be heard, he would listen, completely, without a single sound. They once tried letting Orion out to walk with the other dogs. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't shove or bark or pull. When a younger dog snarled at him, Orion simply stepped away, slowly, and sat down. Not out of fear, not in retreat. As if he had long ago learned that most battles aren't worth fighting. Not if peace is still an option. One volunteer once sat by Orion's kennel for nearly an hour, saying nothing, just trying to understand why a dog like him still hadn't been adopted. Later, they wrote in the shelter journal, "I don't think Orion is waiting for someone. He's searching for a gaze that sees beyond worn fur and passing years, and if you look long enough, you'll see he's never stopped guarding something." And they were right. Orion didn't wait for pity. He didn't demand attention. He simply watched, like a gatekeeper to memories too sacred to leave behind. People often think of rescue dogs as lost souls, waiting for compassion, hoping for a home, for someone to come and call their name. But with Orion, it was never quite that simple. Because his eyes didn't ask, "Will you choose me?" They whispered something else entirely. "I'm still here. Do you remember?" On afternoons when the wind whistled through the corridor and lifted stray hairs from the old kennel gate, Orion would lift his head, not to sniff the breeze for something new, but as if searching for something that once dissolved into the air. A figure, a sound, a promise, long ago spoken. No one could quite say what held him together in such serene stillness. Maybe it was a memory. A warm breath once pressed to his cheek, a familiar voice that no longer echoed down the hall. But Orion never resented what was lost. He simply held it, like a sentinel, loyal to the final thread of something precious. In all the times people passed by, Orion never wagged his tail first. He never pushed himself into view, never became a pitiful performance to win a second glance. On bitter nights, he curled in the corner of his kennel, but his ears stayed alert and his gaze fixed far beyond the wall, as if keeping a promise to someone. No one knew when that promise began. Maybe it was a rainy night, the moment he was left behind without understanding why. Maybe it was a rushed goodbye, a whispered, "Wait for me," lost between taillights and red dust. But Orion never forgot. No matter how long the days stretched, no matter how many faces came and went, he remained, unmoving, unbroken, because he wasn't waiting for an owner. He was waiting for a vow left unfinished. And sometimes, what keeps a soul from falling isn't someone holding it up, but the choice to carry something quietly, all the way through. In the notebooks of shelter volunteers, no name appeared more often than Orion's. Not because he was a difficult case, not because he misbehaved, but because, through all the years, he remained, with a presence so steady, it made people pause. New volunteers were usually assigned simple tasks, cleaning, feeding, socializing with the more playful dogs. But nearly all of them shared one experience during their first week. At some point, while walking past Kennel 27, they would meet Orion's gaze. Not pleading, not eager, just present. And that presence made them stop. Sarah, a senior volunteer who had spent nearly a decade at the shelter, once said she often sat outside Orion's kennel for hours, just reading. Orion never came closer. But he lay still, breathing evenly, as if holding her in the calm space of his watch. She laughed once and said, "I read." He listens. Sometimes I think he listens better than my husband. Dylan, a veterinary student doing his internship, once wrote in his semester report, "No lecture taught me how to communicate without words. But Orion did." Everyone at the shelter adored Orion. One brought him a new cushion, another snuck extra treats into his bowl. On cold days, a soft blanket would appear in the corner of his kennel. No one spoke of it, but someone always did it. Yet even among all that quiet love, Orion remained without a home. Families came and went, eyes scanned past. Names were called: Bella, Rocky, Luna, Scout. Small dogs bounded out, tails wagging. Stories began with a bark and ended with a backseat ride home. Each time, Orion watched, but he never pushed against the gate, never barked. He simply observed, then turned inward and lay back down. One day, a woman stood before his kennel longer than most, middle-aged, quiet. She asked a staff member, "He seems gentle. Why hasn't anyone chosen him?" The young staff member only shrugged, then exhaled softly. "I think maybe it's because he makes people think," she said. Orion's presence wasn't easy to touch, but once it did, it left a silence. And in a shelter where most dogs made noise to be seen, Orion chose stillness. To be remembered. Shelters often labeled their dogs, not unkindly, but for clarity. Friendly, energetic, great with kids, needs patience. But there were other labels, unofficial ones, given by glances, by hesitation, by the slight turn of someone's body as they walked past. To many potential adopters, Orion carried 3 silent labels: too old, too serious, too much past. When a puppy wagged its tail, bouncing with joy at every visitor, it made people feel instantly loved. Orion didn't do that. He showed little. His gaze was deep, so deep in fact it made some feel seen. Too seen. People feared quiet things, especially the kind they couldn't explain. Once, a family visited with 2 small children. As they passed Orion's kennel, the older boy stopped and stared. "I like this dog," he said. But the father read the note on the gate and gently shook his head. 8 years old? That's old. We should get a younger one. We'll have more time together." Another couple glanced at the intake file, then whispered to each other, "Rescue dog from an accident zone? No known background? Let's check that playful one instead." Orion had no defense against those labels. He didn't try to correct them. He didn't try to be cuter. But in the way he stood there, every single day, without complaint, without change, people began to sense something oddly steady about him, as if the very past he carried was the reason he stood so firmly. Maggie, a longtime shelter coordinator, once said in a staff meeting, "Orion isn't a dog for every home. He's not here to fill a temporary void. He's the kind of presence that reminds you to be accountable to yourself." And maybe that's why he stayed. 6 years, same kennel, no official name, no interested tag, just a pair of eyes waiting to be acknowledged, not because he was cute, not because he needed saving, but because he deserved to be heard. Emily arrived at the shelter on a damp February morning. The sky was gray and heavy, like a worn blanket left out to dry. She was 27, small-framed, hair tied back, her sneakers frayed at the seams, and in her hand, a notebook covered in bright stickers, the only splash of color in the muted corridor of kennels. On her first walk through the main hall, she didn't stop at the cages full of barking, bouncing dogs. She moved slowly, quietly, scanning each face behind the mesh, as though searching for something not written in any intake report. She nearly passed Kennel 27 without notice, until she felt a gaze on her, one that didn't cling or beg, not wet with longing, just deep, still, like a lake stirred gently by a breeze it already expected. Emily stopped. She read the info sheet posted outside. Breed, German Shepherd. Age, approximately 8. Name, Orion, temporary. Days in care, 2,380. She repeated the number in her head. 2,380 days, 6 years. A dog sitting, quietly, for 6 whole years. She looked again. Orion still sat upright, ears perked, eyes steady. He wasn't the one being chosen. It felt strangely like he was the one choosing where to rest his gaze. And Emily's heart clenched, just slightly. In the following weeks, she found herself passing by Kennel 27 more than necessary, sometimes with towels, sometimes refilling food, sometimes for no reason at all. Each time, Orion was the same. No barking, no jumping, no wagging, just sitting, watching, breathing. With other dogs, Emily laughed, played, gave commands, shared affection freely, but not with Orion. She didn't try, didn't dare, because something about him made her believe, if she wasn't entirely sincere, he would know. One afternoon, while cleaning the far end of the corridor, Emily sat down across from his kennel, leaving a respectful distance. She didn't call his name, didn't reach out. She simply opened her notebook and wrote, Kennel 27. Eyes that seem to be waiting for something no one remembers. And in that very moment, Orion turned his head toward her, not startled, as if he already knew. That night, the shelter fell into its usual quiet rhythm. The wind slipped through the outer door frames. The ceiling fan hummed gently, a metronome in the breath of sleeping dogs. Emily left later than usual. Before she stepped out, she paused before Orion's kennel, not bending down, not speaking, just standing there, hands clasped in front of her, as if trying to hear something never spoken aloud. Back in her small apartment on the edge of town, Emily turned on a warm light, heated some soup, and settled onto the couch. She placed her phone on the table, meaning to scroll through the evening, but instead, Orion's eyes came back to her, as vividly as if he were sitting across the room. It was a gaze that didn't plead, yet left a heaviness in the chest. It didn't complain, but seemed to carry the silence of an entire life once lived, never spoken of. It wasn't looking to be rescued. It was keeping something for someone who may never return. Emily picked up her phone and opened her photo library. Among the hundreds of snapshots of shelter dogs, there was only one picture of Orion. She had taken it by chance, capturing a shaft of sunlight slanting through the mesh, casting a shadow over his upright ears, and those still, searching eyes that seemed to touch something long buried. The photo didn't show his face clearly, but it captured something else. Stillness. She opened a social media app, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if every word held the weight of a testimony. This is Orion. He's been at the shelter for 6 years, over 2,300 days. He's never been chosen, not because he's bad, not because he's not beautiful, maybe just because he's too quiet to be seen. Orion doesn't jump when you walk past. He doesn't wag frantically. He just sits and waits. I don't know who he's waiting for, but I don't think anyone should have to wait that long. If you're reading this, please share. Maybe the person he's waiting for is also waiting to see him. She attached the photo, tagged the shelter, and pressed post. No expectations, no agenda, no hope of going viral. She simply thought, if tomorrow morning Orion is still sitting there, then at least tonight, his story would have stretched beyond the 4 walls of Kennel 27, like a flicker of light reaching into the quiet shadows of forgotten things. And in that moment, as her phone was placed face down, as the thin blanket was pulled to her chest and her eyes gently closed, somewhere, in another city, a man looked up from his cold cup of coffee, unlocked his phone, and saw that photo. The next morning, Emily's alarm rang at 6:30, just like always. She turned it off, not rushing to rise. The sky outside was still gray, light barely threading through the curtains. She made coffee, cupping the warmth in her hands, staring quietly out the kitchen window. Everything was as usual until she flipped her phone over. Notifications, dozens of them. No, hundreds. Messages, comments, shares. In just 8 short hours of sleep, her post about Orion had been shared over 2,000 times. Comments poured in. That gaze, it breaks me. Please, someone adopt this boy. I'm in Texas. I'd fly out just to hug him. How do I adopt? Please give details. Emily stared, stunned. She tapped on the image, the faceless photo with no filter, no headline, and saw it reposted by strangers. Even a well-known artist had shared it with the caption, "Some souls don't need words. They just need someone to pause long enough to listen. By noon, the post had passed 20,000 shares. Maggie, the shelter coordinator, called while Emily stood in the courtyard, a bag of dog food still unopened in her arms. Her voice was a mix of disbelief and excitement. "That post of yours! It's exploding. The state's media rep just called. Local news stations are asking questions. And get this, a documentary company from LA just messaged us." Emily could barely believe it. For 6 years, Orion had sat in silence, unseen by anyone but the volunteers, and now a global network was leaning into that silence, as if, together, they were all hearing the same quiet truth they had once walked past. That afternoon, the shelter phone rang non-stop. A volunteer had to set up a dedicated email inbox just to handle the flood of adoption requests, from Washington, from Oregon, even from British Columbia. One couple even offered to fund private air transport, if that's what it took. But none of them, not one, could have anticipated the message that would change everything. Among the thousands of shares and DMs, one message arrived quietly. Not in the comments, not on a public feed, but as a direct email to the shelter. Just one sentence, no profile picture, no greeting, no punctuation. Only, "I think that's my dog." His name is Orion. Emily stood frozen in the office, phone in hand, breath catching in her throat. The shelter's small office was bathed in dim light filtering through dusty windows. She curled into the chair, hands tight around her phone. Outside, volunteers chatted excitedly about the post's momentum. But Emily could hear only the silence inside that single line. A line that didn't ask how to adopt, didn't request more info. It simply knew. "I think that's my dog. His name is Orion." And in that moment, Emily's heart skipped, as if all the certainty she thought she had suddenly felt paper thin. No one outside the shelter knew that name. No one ever called him that, except the few volunteers who'd been there long enough. In the official records, he was only AS-12, just a kennel code, nothing more. The name Orion had been whispered into existence by a former volunteer, inspired by the constellation he seemed to gaze at night after night through the mesh. A private name. Never published, never posted, not in photos, not in descriptions. Emily sat frozen. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tapped the sender's name. Daniel Rivers. The next message came slowly, as if it had taken a lifetime to gather the courage. "I lost him in an accident. Back then, there was nothing left. I searched for years, but couldn't find him. If it really is him, please let me know." Emily swallowed hard. Her eyes blurred with an emotion she couldn't name. Not quite joy. Not exactly sorrow. But something like watching a miracle breathe softly across a screen. She handed the phone to Maggie. They stood silently, shoulder to shoulder, staring down at the message. "Did he send anything else?" Maggie asked quietly. Emily nodded and scrolled. There, 3 photos were attached. In the first, a German shepherd bounding through snow, tongue lolling, mouth open in what looked like a joyful laugh. In the second, the same dog curled before a fireplace, head resting on the legs of a bearded man with tired eyes. And the last, a direct gaze into the lens, ears upright, steady eyes, that same look Orion had given the world for the last 6 years. The white spot beneath the chin, the split in the fur between the eyes. That gaze, unmistakable. Maggie exhaled, soft and long, like she was finally releasing something that had been buried too deep for too long. "Oh my God, it's him." Emily turned toward the end of the corridor, toward Kennel 27. Orion was still there, sitting tall, like every other day, as if nothing had changed. But today, amidst thousands of shares and kind-hearted strangers swept into the current of his story, there was one man who hadn't just passed him by. One man who didn't need a caption. Didn't need persuasion, because for him, it wasn't just a story, it was a memory, still breathing, still waiting. A man who once called him by the name only he knew, Orion. Jonas Hale lived on the outskirts of Boulder, Colorado, in a rented house with a faded tin roof tucked under the shadow of 2 old pine trees. No white picket fence, no visible house number, just a rusted mailbox squeaking on its hinges, occasionally catching the wrong mail, a flyer or two, and once in a while, a handwritten letter from a fellow veteran. He was 37, but with his tall frame, hard-angled face, and rugged beard, most assumed he was well into his 40s. Old flannel shirts, faded jeans, and a pair of army boots that never seemed to collect dust, the 3 constants of his quiet life. People in town didn't know much about him. They knew he had served. His stance made it obvious. They knew he didn't talk much. He nodded politely, but no one had ever heard him tell stories. They knew he took long morning walks, sometimes stopping by the stream, grazing the surface of the water with his fingers, as if searching for something that had been lost a long time ago. No one asked, and Jonas never offered. He'd served at outposts both foreign and domestic. An impeccable record, decorated, disciplined. But none of it explained the distant, fixed gaze, the look of a man who'd learned how to stay silent with the world. When he came back, Jonas didn't return to the mountain cabin, the one with the wood stove smoke curling out the windows, where dog nails once clicked gently across the plank floor every morning. That house. He left it behind, along with everything inside. Instead, he chose this quiet town. Not far enough to forget. Just far enough so no one would remember for him. Every morning, he drank his coffee in silence. Every evening, he sat in front of the electric fireplace, never turning it on, just watching the false glow like it might still carry the warmth of a fire that once was. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't go to veterans' meetings. He kept only one habit, opening an old photo folder on his computer, scrolling through, stopping, always, at one image, a German shepherd, racing through the snow, tongue out, ears perked, as if calling to him with nothing but a look. His name was Orion, and every time Jonas stared into that frozen moment, he whispered the same quiet question. Where did you go? Some moments don't last more than a second, but they divide a life in 2. Before and after. For Jonas Hale, that moment came in early spring, 2017, at a temporary border outpost near northern Alaska. Snow hadn't fully melted, winds still cut the skin, and the calendar had already flipped into April. The post was built from repurposed containers, steel-roofed, outfitted with makeshift heat. It wasn't much, but it was where Jonas and his team had spent long months, alongside a K-9 officer trained to detect threats buried in snow, fuel, or silence. Orion, then not even 3 years old, was a tactical scent dog, trained by Jonas from the moment he entered the unit. No one understood Orion like Jonas, and no one could command Orion with less than a word, a tilt of the head, a brush behind the ear. That night there were no warning signs. The security logs were clean. Jonas and 2 team members were finishing their end-of-day reports. Orion lay in the corner of the station, head resting on his tucked-in paws, breathing steady, just like always. Until the shriek came. A sharp, unnatural sound, not born of wind or wildlife. Then a blinding white flash, and then nothing but the roar. When Jonas opened his eyes, he didn't know where he was. No voices, no barking, just a smear of white and black, like a burnt frame from a damaged reel of film. His ears rang. Blood trickled down his temple, and his body throbbed with a pain that felt like it had been torn from the world itself. They said he was found nearly 3 hours later, over a kilometer from the blast site. His body wrapped in an emergency blanket, still breathing, but unconscious. He first woke up in a military hospital. His lips cracked, his breath ragged. But his first question wasn't, "Am I alive?" It was, "Where's the dog?" No one answered. There was no mention of Orion in the evacuation logs. No body, no chip signal. The unit was dissolved shortly after the incident. Part accident, part restructuring. Everything wrapped up hastily, as if to bury something that never had the chance to be examined. Jonas stayed in the hospital for 3 more months. His body healed. But his mind remained in rubble. In those early days, he would jolt awake at night, convinced he'd heard Orion's nails tapping on the hospital floor. Once, he dreamed Orion running through smoke, mouth gripping the brass army badge Jonas used to wear, then vanishing without a bark, as if he had never existed. When discharged, Jonas went back to search. He combed through files, asked around. Records no longer exist, the office said. The station had been dismantled, the team scattered. Orion gone, like he had never been entered into the system. All that remained were faded memories, a handful of photographs. People congratulated Jonas for surviving, called him a hero, asked if he planned to write a book, inspire others, share his story. He only gave a small smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, didn't ripple his face. He never wrote a book, never gave an interview, never spoke on record. The only thing Jonas ever wrote down was the name Orion. On a sticky note, pressed onto the corner of his computer screen, not to remember, but to never forget that what mattered most had been lost, quietly. In the first year, he called every shelter near the former post, sent emails, photos, descriptions, but no one had records. Some even asked, "Are you sure that dog was ever in our system?" Jonas never answered. He just hung up. One day he deleted the entire search folder, not because he had moved on, but because he no longer believed in being found. From that day, Jonas lived quietly, like those who carry war long after the battlefield is gone. He didn't hang pictures. He never adopted another dog. His home remained chillingly bare. Not because it lacked furniture, but because no one could fill the space that was missing. He didn't like crowds, but he walked every morning, past the edge of town, into the small forest, where an old, warped bench sat beneath a birch tree. He'd stop there, rest his hand on the wood. As if he waited long enough, Orion might come bounding from between the trees, tail slow, mouth carrying the smooth stone they used to play fetch with in the snow. But Orion never came. Not that day, not the week after, not the year after that, no sound, no sign, just a single fragile thing that Jonas had once believed he had lost entirely. Faith. He never held a memorial, never dug a grave, but in his mind the end had already been marked, the day the outpost exploded. And to that day, Jonas affixed a punctuation mark, not a full stop, just a quiet pause, because Orion hadn't died. Not officially, no proof, no confirmation. But when no one remembers to look, loss is still loss. The silver SUV rolled slowly into the shelter's gravel lot, kicking up a soft cloud of morning dust in the crisp air. Inside the shelter, no one heard the vehicle arrive. But somewhere, a pair of ears lifted, as if still attuned to footsteps from another life. Jonas stepped out of the car, flannel shirt, worn boots, the same build, but now with a face hollowed by years of silence. And yet, in his eyes, something stirred, not light, not certainty, but perhaps a breath rising from beneath the ashes. He didn't walk in right away. He stood by the car, one hand resting on the door, gazing toward the plain gray building, as though he didn't quite trust that it was real, as though the dream he had waited 6 years to see had finally arrived, but might still vanish like mist. Maggie opened the door for him. No pleasantries, no formalities, just a nod, then a simple gesture down the hall. End of the corridor, Kennel 27. Jonas walked slowly. His boots tapped softly against the concrete floor. The shelter was unusually quiet, only the sounds of breathing dogs, claws shifting lightly on tile, and something else. Unseen. Waiting. Orion was lying down, head resting on his front paws. The early morning light filtered through the wire mesh, casting uneven stripes across the floor. He wasn't asleep, but not fully awake either, until a footstep paused in front of his kennel. Orion lifted his head. Didn't jump, didn't react with urgency. He just looked. But this gaze, it was longer than any in the past 6 years, deeper than all the glances that had passed him by. And then, what happened next surprised everyone. Orion stood. Not a leap, not a lunge, just one solid step forward, slow, deliberate. Then he stopped. No barking, no growling, no frenzied tail, none of the viral reunion theatrics the internet had grown used to. Orion did what he had done every single day for 6 years. He sat, ears upright, eyes locked onto the man before him. But this time, he wasn't looking through a stranger. He wasn't searching for something lost. This time, Orion was seeing everything, a face once familiar, changed, scarred, but still carrying the breath, the scent, the heartbeat he had never once forgotten. Jonas stood frozen. The corridor held its breath. And in that dense silence, something small happened. Orion tilted his head slightly to the right. Just a bit. A motion Jonas knew all too well. A silent cue, their shared language from the field. Is it you? Jonas dropped to his knees, one hand resting on the cold floor, the other braced gently on his knee. No sudden moves. No words. As if one wrong breath might dissolve the moment like mist. A soft click broke the air. The latch on Kennel 27 slid open. It was quiet. Almost nothing. But it changed everything. A few dogs lifted their heads in neighboring pens. Tails stirred faintly. Even they sensed something had shifted. Jonas didn't step in. He stayed there, kneeling, still. Orion stared, unwavering, unshaken. Then he moved. 1 step, 2. Not rushed, not slow, but in rhythm, as though his body had been holding this pace for 6 years, waiting for permission to complete the journey. He sat, less than a hand's breadth away from Jonas, didn't lick his face, didn't cry out, just sat. Back straight, ears erect, eyes clear, no longer dulled by waiting. And he looked, as if to memorize every line of the face before him, this time not to search, but to hold on to. Jonas looked up. Their eyes met. No one spoke. No one needed to. He reached out, touching gently the bridge of Orion's nose, where gray fur now threaded through old black. And for the first time in 6 years, Orion didn't hold back. He leaned into the hand. Not braced, not guarded. Like time itself had softened and settled between them. A low sound escaped Orion's chest. Not a bark, not a whine, but a tremble, a quiet vibration rising from deep inside his ribs, the kind of sound only made when a soul finds its way home. Jonas whispered, voice gravel thick. "I'm here now. You don't have to wait anymore." Orion didn't respond, not with words. He just closed his eyes. And then, for the first time in years, his tail moved. Once, twice, 3 slow, steady beats against the floor. Software even. Like a knock on a door. Like a heartbeat. Like an answer without language. I know. And in that hallway, a place that had long been a passageway for forgotten animals and fading hopes, there rose something more powerful than any bark. Recognition. Orion had found home. Not through sight, not through a call, but by the way he stepped forward and sat down, just like every other day. Only this time, he was looking at the one he had never stopped believing would return. The one who was home. After the reunion, more quiet than dramatic, but no less miraculous, Jonas sat for hours in Maggie's office, hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, his eyes fixed on the faded file folder Emily had unearthed from the archives. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the printed ink washed out like it had been soaked in rain. A few lines of handwriting remained in blue pen, faint, fragile, still breathing with time. At the top corner of the yellowed page, a faint line read, "Transferred from Dawson Ridge Rescue, 2017. Jonas looked up. Dawson Ridge? Maggie nodded gently. A small shelter along the Klamath River, shut down about 6 years ago, after a major flood. Emily added, her voice low. It was completely submerged. Infrastructure collapsed. Staff scattered. They never digitized their records. Everything was boxed and moved into temporary archives, and nearly disappeared. Jonas's hand tightened around his teacup. He remembered that name, Dawson Ridge, a passing reference during his search years ago. But no one had ever mentioned that they'd received dogs from a military zone. No one spoke of a large German shepherd, quiet, aging, carrying in his eyes a story too long to tell. The reason was heartbreakingly simple. No one had the records. Emily flipped another page, a sparse intake form from 2017. Under dog's name, it read only, no ID, male, German shepherd, estimate 2 to 3 years old. No chip. No former owner. The only note, found near military perimeter, shows signs of prior training. A single line, buried among hundreds of similar documents, never reread, never cross-referenced. The flood had come fast. A spring storm swelled the river beyond its banks. Dawson Ridge was swallowed by mud and splinters. The dogs were evacuated in haste. No time to review papers. No one left to match histories to bodies. Orion, nameless then, was among dozens of untraceable strays transferred to Shelter Haven, where Maggie and Emily worked. And from that moment forward, he had waited. 6 years. Jonas nodded slowly, eyes still locked on the pages. I used to think, if I just pushed a little harder. Maggie interrupted, gently but firmly. It wasn't your fault. This system has too many cracks. Most people never get the chance to close a chapter that was torn out mid-sentence. Jonas didn't reply. He only exhaled, deep and heavy, as if touching a part of himself he'd long believed unreachable. The room fell quiet. Only the soft rustle of turning paper and the whisper of wind outside the window remained. But in that silence, something had become unmistakably clear. Orion had not been forgotten. He had been misplaced by a system too fragmented, too impatient to hold on to things without labels. Jonas wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. He had outlasted long campaigns, witnessed loss, held the last breath of men beside him, and once of a dog named Orion. He knew what survival meant, and worse, he knew what it meant to search and come up empty. But Orion was different. The day Jonas woke up after the explosion, his first words weren't about pain or injury. Did anyone see my dog? The nurse stared, not understanding. The doctors urged him to rest, dodging the question with vague headshakes. In the weeks that followed, he asked the response team, commanding officers, then picked up the phone himself, calling every unit that might have taken in a K-9 after an accident. One day, a sliver of hope emerged. A German shepherd was taken to a temporary quarantine center, but no confirmation it's the same one. He clung to that, grasping it like a thread in a raging current. He sent photos, descriptions, even handwritten letters. No reply. The answer was always the same. No chip, no file, no match. And that phrase became the first wall in a bureaucratic maze he could never break through. He drove nearly 2,000 miles in 2 months, stopping at shelters across mountain ranges and floodplains. Everywhere that might have received a dog like Orion, a displaced survivor. At one shelter, he stood outside the fence, watching a German shepherd with a near-identical gait, until the dog didn't react. And Jonas turned away, never going in. Every hope was followed by defeat. Until one day, he sat on the cold floor of his rented home, hands over his head, eyes blank, thinking only one thing. If he were alive, he would have come back to me. That sentence played on repeat, etching the final mark on a map he had once drawn by memory. After that, Jonas stopped asking, stopped calling, stopped writing. He deleted Orion's photos from his phone, not to forget, but because it hurt too much to see what he couldn't reach. People in town said he was quiet, private, a man with no attachments, but no one knew. No one knew how many emails he wrote, how many towns he passed through, how many hours he waited by the phone, just to hear one line. "We may have seen your dog." In the end, Jonas didn't stop searching because he no longer loved Orion. He stopped because that love had transformed into something else. A quiet ache that pulsed too deeply to risk one more disappointment. That afternoon, the sun was gentle. The shelter rested in a soft kind of silence, not the heavy silence of sorrow, but the kind that lingers at the end of a song, right at its longest-held note. Maggie led Jonas and Orion to the grassy yard out back, a space seldom used, where a few sleepy dogs liked to lounge in the sun, and the old maple tree scattered patchy shadows over the uneven earth. She told them they could stay as long as they liked. No one would interrupt. Orion walked slowly, his paws more familiar with soft grass now than cold concrete. Jonas walked beside him, no leash. But Orion didn't stray. He didn't need to. He knew. He had always known. They stopped beneath the tree, where sunlight split across their bodies in quiet halves, and sat. Jonas didn't speak right away. He looked around, as if trying to memorize this place, not because it was beautiful, but because here, he would say something he'd carried in his chest for 6 long years. Orion lay down beside him, head resting on Jonas's leg. He asked for nothing, expected nothing. Time passed. Then, Jonas spoke, softly, barely loud enough for himself to hear. "I thought I gave it everything I had, but maybe it wasn't enough." He reached down, ran a hand gently over Orion's head. The fur was thick, warm, real. No longer a pixelated image on a computer screen, no longer the ghost of a sound in a dream. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for not going further, for not looking longer, for not believing. There was still a chance." Orion didn't move, but his tail tapped once, just once, then stopped. Like forgiveness that doesn't always arrive with fanfare, like a soul that had already made peace, long before the words came. Jonas lifted his head. His eyes shimmered, not from tears, but from a wound deep inside that had just begun to close, not with medicine, but with presence. He leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against Orion's, the way he used to, after long training days. Not to say, "Good job," not even "well done," but something quieter. "I'm here, always here." Orion didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes and sighed, a long, whole breath, deep, final, as if he had gathered the weight of 6 years just to let it go, in that one perfect exhale. The small rental house on the outskirts of Boulder hadn't changed in years. The rust-speckled tin roof, the creaking floorboards that groaned under every shifted seat, and the hallway light that flickered each evening like a habit no one ever bothered to fix. But for Jonas, for the first time in 6 years, that threshold wasn't empty anymore. Orion stepped across it like he'd never left. His nose swept across the doormat, then paused at the exact spot by the old fireplace, the place he used to lie, head resting on Jonas's legs after long patrols. No barking, no guidance needed. He simply turned his head, gazing back at Jonas still standing in the doorway, as if to gently say, "We're home." Jonas smiled, one hand still resting on the doorframe, as if grounding himself. His eyes betrayed the years. Tired, yes, but there was light there again, a flicker of something old, something once buried beneath the sound of an explosion. 2 days later, when the rhythm of life had just begun to take shape again, Jonas made a decision. He took Orion back to the place that held more memories for them than any other, the small forest south of town. That morning was clearer than most. Sunlight bled through the canopy like stained glass, pooling golden and moss-green shadows on the forest floor. The old trail curved gently between tall trees, just as it always had, only now the branches seemed more brittle, time having added a few more cracks. Orion didn't tug the leash. He didn't stray. He walked beside Jonas, head held high, ears attuned to every shift in the air, the flutter of wings, the rustle of leaves, and something less tangible, the breath of a land that remembered every paw print ever pressed into its soil. As they neared the old crooked bench, the one Jonas had sat on, year after year alone, he paused, fingers brushing the worn wood. "Here we are," he murmured, almost to himself. Orion stopped too. But unlike before, he didn't lie down. Instead, he remained still, head tilted toward a narrow path on the other side of the trees, a path barely visible, just a faint indent between two low-hanging branches. Jonas noticed. He turned his gaze in the same direction. "What is it, buddy?" Orion didn't respond right away. He was listening. Then, his ears twitched, just slightly. A sound. Faint. Delicate. But enough to make Orion step forward once. Jonas narrowed his eyes. The forest had shifted, not with danger, but with something urgent, a pull. Orion turned to look at Jonas, eyes bright in that familiar way, focused, alert, ready to lead. Jonas tightened the leash, not to restrain but like a handshake between comrades. "Let's go." And they left the old trail behind. Toward something no one expected, toward a place where Orion's story would turn once more, where he wouldn't just be the dog who was found, but the dog who would now find others. Orion picked up his pace as they slipped into the faint track, not frantic, but purposeful. The dry leaves beneath his paws whispered in brittle crackles, muted by the hush of the forest holding its breath. Jonas followed close behind, his eyes scanning every flick of fur, every shift in his partner's posture. He didn't speak, but every muscle was ready. The deeper they went, the air thickened. Damp soil rose with the scent of old bark and moss. Tree roots clawed across the path like time's old scars. Above, the sun splintered through layered leaves, spotting the ground like breadcrumbs toward something just out of reach. Then, Orion stopped. He didn't bark, didn't charge. He stood still, his body tight, head lowered, ears high, nostrils pulling in the air, sifting every molecule. Jonas leaned forward, voice low. "You smell something?" Orion glanced back, didn't move, then turned his head left, disappearing between two thin trees into a sparse patch of branches. Gone from view. 1 second. 2. And then, a sound. So small, so soft, it could have been a breath. But it wasn't. It was a sob. a choked, broken sound, like the world had forgotten someone and they had finally dared to make a noise again. Jonas froze. Jonas pushed through the low branches, following the trail Orion had chosen, and then his heart stopped. There, in a shallow hollow strewn with damp leaves and brittle twigs, a little girl, no older than 5 or 6, sat curled up at the base of a rotting tree stump. Her hair was a tangled mess, a worn stuffed animal clutched in one hand. Her eyes were wide and red-rimmed, cheeks streaked with tears. Her jacket was torn, her shoes caked with mud, laces undone. Orion sat before her, not too close, but close enough. His body low, head slightly tilted, tail moving in soft, slow sweeps. The girl looked at him. At first, wary. Then trembling, she reached out and placed a hand on the thick fur at his neck. Orion didn't flinch. He tilted his head, just enough for her fingers to rest. A breath escaped her, long and trembling, like something she had held too tightly in her chest for too long. Jonas stepped forward slowly, voice warm and steady. "What's your name, sweetheart? Are you lost?" The girl didn't answer. Her lips moved. Then she turned to Orion, as if waiting for permission. Jonas knelt. His eyes met Orion's, and in that moment he understood. Orion had found her. But the task wasn't done. Jonas pulled out his phone, called for rescue. While they waited, he slipped off his jacket and draped it around her shoulders. Orion lay beside her, his back pressing gently against her legs, a silent wall between her and the world. When the rescue team arrived, they were stunned to find the girl calm, her head resting on the back of a gray and black German shepherd. But what truly silenced them was who she was. The daughter of Claire Addison, a town council member who had fiercely opposed therapy dogs in the community. The news spread faster than anyone expected. Less than 24 hours after the rescue unit released the photo of Orion, his calm eyes, his weathered coat, his still presence beside the rescued child in Pine Hollow Forest, the first article appeared. Abandoned therapy dog rescues councilwoman's daughter in Pine Hollow. Jonas didn't read it. He wasn't watching the news. He only wanted the next morning to be quiet, to drink warm coffee under the soft porch light, while Orion lay beside him, breathing as if the events of the day before were simply another step in the life he had always meant to live. And then came a knock. Software barely there. Jonas opened the door. Standing before him was Claire Addison, hair tied back, her face quieter than he'd ever seen in council chambers, not guarded, not defiant, just a mother. Orion stood. No growl, no wagging frenzy. He simply walked forward, stopped in front of her, and looked up, not accusing, not expectant. Just, "I did what needed to be done." Claire knelt slowly. Her hand trembled as she placed it gently on his head. No justification, no speech, just a whisper, drawn from somewhere deep in her chest. "Thank you." What followed were days of noise that Orion never asked for. Journalists came. The town council convened an emergency session to reconsider their policy on therapy dogs. A new initiative was proposed, titled simply, "The Second Chance Program." Orion never took the stage. He wore no medals. At the ceremony, he sat quietly beside Jonas, head resting lightly on his knee, eyes closed. As if the story everyone was telling had nothing to do with him. And maybe that's why it mattered more, because here was a dog who needed no praise, who asked for no recognition, but who walked toward a frightened child, stayed when no one called, and stood guard as if the world could fall apart around them. And still, trust would remain. And in the hearts of those who once doubted, those who called therapy dogs idealistic, impractical, unnecessary, the image of Orion beside that little girl changed something unspoken. From the dog once labeled too old, too quiet, too full of past, Orion had become a symbol of everything opposite. Right on time, in the right way, and never too late to save someone. One photo, sometimes, is all it takes to change how a whole community sees loyalty. It wasn't taken with a professional camera. It wasn't color-corrected or staged. It was just a moment in Pine Hollow Forest. A German shepherd sitting beside a little girl who leaned her head gently against his neck as the last light of day filtered through the trees, her breath still shaky, her hands still cold. Beneath the photo, a simple caption: "She wasn't found by drone." Not by GPS, but by a heart that never stopped searching. Within hours, the article swept the town's news site. Within a day, it was shared by thousands across animal lover groups, K9 handler forums, then picked up by state channels and national news. Hashtags followed. Orion, the rescue dog. Second chance hero. The dog who waited. He never forgot. No one had expected that an 8-year-old German shepherd, once forgotten behind shelter bars, could move a nation simply by showing up and staying. Local news stations began to show up at Jonas's door. A national morning show requested permission to film a segment. One pet blogger titled the unfolding events as a wordless love song between patience and unconditional grace. Emily, the woman who first posted the adoption call, cried when asked to speak on air. She only said one sentence, but it brought the entire studio to silence. "I don't think I was rescuing Orion. I think he was the one pulling us out of the shadows of indifference." Not long after, a nonprofit specializing in animal-assisted therapy reached out. They invited Jonas and Orion to join their Silent Guardians campaign, not for parades, not for spectacle. Just to be present, a reminder that the beings we once labeled lost causes might become the very hope we never saw coming. Days later, a local school held a Monday assembly. The teacher showed the children the photo of Orion and the little girl, and then asked, "Have you ever felt like what you do is too small for anyone to notice?" A boy in the front row stood up and said, "Like that dog." He didn't need people to notice. He just needed to be in the right place at the right time. The story of Orion didn't end with social media shares. It became a kind of echo. Not shouted, but reaching into quiet corners of the human heart. At a small cafe in downtown Boulder, the owner pinned Orion's photo beside the chalkboard menu. Beneath it, in white cursive, "Today's guest once served 6 years, in a steel cage, and still kept his kindness." An elderly man, who had once passed by Shelter Haven but never gone in, saw Orion's face in the newspaper. He returned to the shelter with nothing but a handwritten card. Inside, in trembling script, "He didn't need me. But I needed to believe I once passed by something good." Maggie kept the card, framed it, hung it beside Orion's file. At the elementary school west of town, a first-grade teacher asked her students to write a letter to a silent hero. Nearly a third of them wrote to Orion. One little girl named May in pencil. "I used to be scared of dogs, but now I think, if I ever get lost, I'd want Orion to find me." Her letter arrived at Shelter Haven, taped to a drawing. Orion, with big ears and a tail long enough to touch the ground. That week, at the community council meeting, Councilwoman Claire Addison, mother of the rescued girl, stood up. She didn't use the microphone. She didn't speak fast. But every word landed. "I used to believe therapy dogs were a luxury. Now I understand. Kindness doesn't come from title, but from how a creature chooses to act when no one asks them to." The room fell silent. No applause. But no one looked away from the image of Orion projected on the big screen. His eyes calm, not resentful, not proud, just present. Present enough to soften even the most weathered beliefs. Online, beneath a video recounting the story, one comment stood out. "We forgot him, but he never forgot us. Over 80,000 likes. No debates. Jonas read it late that night. He switched on the hallway lamp, sat beside Orion asleep at his feet. He stroked the dog's head, as he once did during long deployments, his hands steady now, though his eyes were full. "You forgave us long ago, didn't you?" Orion didn't open his eyes. He shifted gently, exhaled a slow breath, and rested his head on Jonas's leg, as if the answer had never needed words. It was a silence no longer empty, but sacred, the quiet of trust held together, even after being forgotten. That afternoon, a light rain fell. Not enough to puddle, but enough for the scent of wet earth and fallen leaves to slip through the cracks of the wooden porch. Jonas was sorting old books on the shelf when he heard a car pull up. Orion was first to notice. His tail swayed once, not from reflex but from recognition. Emily stepped out, wrapped in a light gray windbreaker, hair tousled by the breeze. She held a small cardboard box and approached the porch. She knocked softly. She didn't get the chance to knock again. Jonas had already opened the door, not surprised, just smiling, as if they had both known this day would come. "Am I intruding?" she asked, her voice hoarse with cold. Jonas shook his head, gestured her in. Orion had risen, approaching her not with noise, but quiet recognition, nose brushing the edge of her coat. Emily knelt. Her hand rested on the thick fur at his neck. And her eyes, they no longer held the sorrow of someone who once pitied, but the steady focus of someone who had something important to share. After a few minutes of sitting together in silence, with warm tea, the soft patter of rain on the roof, and the faint scent of orange peel from the candle on the table, Emily finally opened the box she had brought. Inside were color-printed documents, a sketchbook full of handwritten notes, and a photograph, Orion and the little girl in the forest, printed on thick cardstock with a white border. "I think it's time to create something bigger, not just a story." Jonas set down his tea. His eyes fell to the notebook. "What is it?" "Project Orion," she said simply, as if the name alone carried enough meaning. Emily opened the sketchbook, flipping through the pages. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from knowing what she was about to propose wasn't small. "I want to start a program for dogs like Orion, the ones who were left behind, the ones people said were too old, too quiet, or worse, unadoptable. But I believe, in every one of those eyes, there's still a heart that hasn't stopped beating for us." Jonas said nothing. "I want to bring those dogs to the places that need them most: schools, nursing homes, rehabilitation centers, anywhere there are wounded children, lonely elders, people learning how to stand up again after the fall, and the one to lead the way." Emily looked down at Orion. "I think it should be him." Orion lay under the table, his head resting on the rug, eyes half closed as if asleep. But at those words his ears twitched, just enough for Jonas to know. He was listening, and he understood. "I don't want to start a traditional organization," Emily continued. "No million-dollar fundraising, just a few visits to start. Telling Orion's story, letting people see that what we think was lost can still return to heal." Jonas looked at her, longer than usual. In his eyes was the quiet calculation of someone who had lost, let go, and touched the impossible once more. He turned to Orion. "What do you think?" he asked, half joking, half serious. Orion didn't move, but then, slowly, he stood, walked toward Emily, and did something rare. He placed his head gently in her hand, not seeking warmth, but giving consent. Emily smiled, eyes a little red. "So, shall we begin?" Jonas nodded. "Where do we start?" Emily opened to the first page of the sketchbook, written in blue ink, "Riverbend High School, next Tuesday," and beneath it, in smaller italics, Orion won't come to say anything. He'll just come to be himself. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change someone. In the first week of Project Orion, Emily posted just one photo and a simple caption. Day 1. He said nothing, but the classroom went quiet. The photo showed Orion curled beside a small chair next to a curly-haired girl holding a book. She was reading The Little Prince, tracing each word with her finger, but her eyes kept glancing sideways toward the German shepherd sitting quietly beside her, his ears tilted toward her voice, as if he were listening to every syllable, every pause. The reading lasted 20 minutes. No teacher interrupted. No one corrected her pronunciation. There was only Orion, not interfering, not rushing, and because of that, for the first time in that classroom, a girl who had always sat in the back, afraid of every glance, finally felt heard. 2 days later, Orion was invited to the Westfield Veteran Recovery Center. Jonas didn't bring a leash. Orion walked into the common room, where men who once wore uniforms now sat quietly in wheelchairs and recliners, their eyes fixed on the soft afternoon sun spilling over the fading lawn. One of them, Mr. Carl, a former Marine, had not spoken since his stroke. Staff said he hadn't responded to therapy or engaged with visitors in months. Orion didn't approach immediately. He stood at the threshold, then calmly made his way to Mr. Carl's chair and sat. His eyes never left the man's face. No one signaled him. No one trained him to do this. But when Mr. Carl slowly turned his head, and his left hand, stiff with time, trembled its way upward to touch the thick fur at Orion's neck, the entire room fell still. The next moment, Carl's eyes welled with tears, and then he spoke, the first words he had uttered in months. "Thank you for coming back." No one was sure who he meant. Maybe Orion. Maybe someone from a distant war zone, long gone. Maybe a memory that still lingered. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he spoke. Weeks later, Orion appeared in a juvenile courtroom, where an 11-year-old girl was scheduled to testify in her parents' ongoing divorce trial. She had refused to attend unless she was allowed to bring her friend Orion. The court agreed. Orion didn't take the witness stand. He simply sat beside her, his head resting against her leg. Silent, steady. When her voice trembled, she reached for his fur and found something to hold on to. The judge, known for his no-nonsense demeanor, lowered his glasses and nodded. After the session, he pulled Jonas and Emily aside. "I've never seen a presence quiet a courtroom like that." Orion was never trained to perform. He didn't know how to shake hands. He didn't spin in circles. He didn't bow or pose for applause. He simply showed up. And in that quiet act of being, he changed everything. At the public library, he lay beside a young autistic boy struggling with comic book pages. Without instruction, Orion positioned himself at the perfect distance, not so close as to overwhelm, but not so far as to feel absent. The boy's mother stood a few feet away, accustomed to her son rejecting all proximity, even from people. But that day, for the first time, she heard him let out a quiet laugh. Not from the comic, but from the way Orion softly sneezed, then gently nudged his head onto the boy's trembling arm. At Cedar Pines retirement home, an old man named Harold, a former literature teacher, said nothing when Orion entered. But minutes later, he opened a drawer and pulled out a worn notebook. He began to write. Each time Orion visited, Harold added to it. No one could decipher the handwriting. Shaky, faded. But when his son, a businessman from another state, came to visit, Harold handed him the notebook and said simply, "A friend comes by every week. He doesn't say anything, but reminds me I still exist." At a trauma rehab center, a young woman partially paralyzed from a car crash had refused all emotional therapy. She'd never engaged, never even turned her head. But when Orion entered the group room, she watched him from across the space. And when he stopped beside her, she reached out with her functioning hand and rested it on his head. That one gesture made a nurse cry. "Orion doesn't make you notice life by barking," the nurse later said. "He makes you feel it, through silence." He didn't need a leash, didn't need commands or choreography. Orion simply was, like dawn arriving every morning. Quiet, but enough to remind you that you're allowed to begin again. In every place he entered, the air changed. Not with excitement, but with a softness that settled over wounds never named. That was what Jonas saw each time he looked at Orion, resting quietly in the corner of a room, beside a child learning to speak, or a grieving elder learning to let go. Not everyone needs instructions, but everyone needs someone willing to stay. Not out of duty, but by choice. Orion didn't break barriers with sound. He rebuilt connections through presence, a presence that was real. And sometimes, as Emily once said, that's all a wounded soul needs to begin healing. One early autumn afternoon, as leaves turned golden atop the Timber Grove Recovery Center, Emily stood by the hallway window. Across the glass, in the small literacy room, a little girl struggled to pronounce a word from a book about the universe. Orion lay next to her, still as ever. He didn't move, didn't pant. Just watched, his eyes calm as a morning lake. Suddenly, the girl stopped at a difficult word. Her lips pressed tight, her brow furrowed, her eyes flickered, ready to give up. Then she turned, just slightly, and met Orion's gaze. He was still there, not urging, not leaving, just there. And that was enough for her to keep going. Emily tightened her grip around the notebook in her hands. On its cover was the new logo for Project Orion, a silhouette of a dog sitting quietly behind a child facing forward. No leash, no lead, but both moving toward the light. When Jonas stepped forward, he stood beside her for a long while without saying a word. Together they watched in silence. Then, softly, Emily spoke. "People used to keep dogs to guard gates, homes, and property?" Jonas gave a quiet nod. "But now, I think differently. Orion doesn't guard doors. He guards hearts." The words, simple, unadorned, fell like a key turning gently in a lock, unlocking something that, for all these months, no one had yet named. Orion hadn't shown up to block the world out. He didn't place himself in front of danger to impress anyone. He didn't do the work of a gatekeeper. He did the work of a friend, a silent witness to faith that never left. And in a world brimming with noise, where worth is too often measured by appearance or speed, Orion's quiet presence stood as a gentle reminder. Some things don't need walls to be protected, only someone patient enough to stay, loyal enough to listen, and kind enough to hold on to what is most fragile. One day, when people look back at Project Orion, with its visits, its stories, its reborn laughter, they'll understand. It all began with a forgotten dog, locked away behind steel bars for 6 long years, and somehow, by simply being who he was, he unlocked doors inside others that no key ever could. That morning, sunlight streamed through the iron fence of Shelter Haven, but it no longer carried the loneliness it once did. A thin layer of dew blanketed the yard, casting a soft silver sheen that shimmered under the sky's early light. The scent of damp grass mingled with the distant barks echoing from deep inside the main building. But this time, the sounds held more than waiting. Maggie, the shelter manager, stood at the front yard with a clipboard in hand, eyes fixed on the car that had just pulled up near the gravel lot. Emily stepped out first, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Jonas followed behind her. And then came Orion, not as 12 on a record sheet, but as a living symbol of loyalty and patience. Orion walked through the familiar gate. The pebbles beneath his paws were still there, some worn smooth from the years he'd paced them. But this return was different. No one was there to choose him. There were no hesitant stares, no indifferent footsteps passing by Kennel 12. Only smiles and quiet nods, as if welcoming home someone who came back bearing something more valuable than any title: restored faith. At the far end of the kennels, where Orion had once lived, a small space had been set aside. Not a grand memorial, not a polished exhibit, just a simple wooden plaque mounted beneath the turning leaves of a maple tree. Carved into it by hand: Orion, the dog who waited 6 years to give hope. Beside the words was a series of photographs. Orion's eyes through the kennel bars, still, steady. Then, the moment he found the little girl in the forest, the day he lay beside a first grader sounding out her words, and the image no one could forget. The sunlight cutting through the bars, falling on him as he walked out of the shelter for the very last time. Maggie stepped forward and laid her hand gently on the plaque. "We were afraid we had let him wait too long," her voice cracked. "But maybe he was waiting for something bigger than being chosen." Emily placed the flowers in a small vase below the plaque, next to a pair of worn canvas shoes, washed and neatly set, once worn by the first volunteer who ever walked Orion outside. Jonas said nothing. He simply stood behind Orion, resting a hand on his back, as if every word, every emotion had already been spoken in the quiet rhythm of the dog's breath. In that moment, a breeze stirred the air. A few maple leaves floated down in slow spirals, like unspoken thank yous. The dogs in the kennels fell silent. Some wagged their tails. Others sat down. No one taught them to do that. But in the presence of Orion, in the very place that once symbolized abandonment, every creature seemed to understand. Waiting, sometimes, is not in vain. And returning is how some stories don't end, but begin to live in new ways. Orion's Corner wasn't a place built for tears. It was a space to pause, to reflect, to remember, and to witness how patience, even when buried in darkness, could become a light for others. Beneath the plaque, a small glass cabinet rested on a shelf crafted from repurposed wood, salvaged from the old Kennel Row 3, next to where Orion had once been kept. Inside were 3 items, not many, but each carried a piece of a journey that stretched across more than half a dog's life. The first, a black and white photo, taken with a phone during Orion's first year at Shelter Haven. In it, he's sitting, not growling, not resisting, just sitting. Back straight, ears upright, eyes steady. That photo once got lost among hundreds in the shelter's adoption files, until Emily found it and kept it as a quiet emblem of resilience. Beside it, a worn leather collar. The buckle rusted, the surface darkened with time. Faintly, the letter O still marked one side, hand-punched by a former shelter worker. When Jonas first saw it, he stood still for a long while. Not because of the collar itself, but because it was the last thing that survived the old rescue facility, destroyed years ago by flooding. It was also the same collar Jonas had buckled around Orion's neck, back when he was still a border patrol dog. And in the center of the case, resting in a dark mahogany frame, a small silver badge. Engraved on it, AS-12 Shelter Haven, not yet adopted. It had once been tossed in a forgotten filing box, buried among damp paperwork. Emily found it in Orion's 6th year at the shelter. She cleaned it, placed it in a tin, and never spoke of it. But when Orion's story spread, she knew this tiny thing deserved to be seen, because sometimes the smallest reminders are the ones that tell the greatest truths. Beneath the 3 items in the glass case was a small handwritten plaque, printed in soft typeface. These aren't relics, they are living evidence that some souls don't wait to be rescued, they wait to be understood. And once understood, they become light for those still lost. A group of high school students visiting the shelter that day stood in silence before the display for nearly 10 minutes. One girl, with chestnut hair and a sketchbook in her hand, slowly began to draw Orion's posture. No colors, just pencil, but the eyes were vivid. Under her sketch, she wrote, "Not looking for anyone, but seeing everything." Orion's story, from a numbered kennel tag to becoming a living symbol, now lived not just in adults or newspaper articles or social media shares. It lived in the quiet footsteps of those who paused before the glass case. And in the hearts of children learning, perhaps for the first time, that every creature holds value, if only someone is willing to stop long enough to truly see. After the small memorial ceremony, Orion didn't leave right away. He had something else to do. Jonas noticed when Orion quietly stepped away from the group, still mingling under the maple tree. The German Shepherd walked past the left wing of kennels, the one now reserved for older dogs or those returned after failed adoptions. There were no commands, no cues. Orion walked like he knew exactly who or what he was looking for. Emily noticed and murmured softly, "Benny's kennel is at the end." Benny, a 3-year-old pit bull mix, gray-coated with pale brown eyes, had been adopted twice and returned both times. The notes read, "Too withdrawn, not bonding, hard to train." After his last return, Benny lay curled in the corner of his kennel for 3 days without eating. Maggie had once told Emily, "That boy doesn't believe anyone will stay." Orion stopped in front of kennel 17. No barking, no pawing. He simply sat, exactly the way he had for 6 years in front of kennel 12. Every morning, every afternoon, every time footsteps passed without stopping. Benny didn't approach at first. He lifted his head, and their eyes met, one young, bruised but unsure, the other seasoned, steady. It was a silent moment between two souls who carried the same fractures. Orion didn't move, but his tail tapped the floor. Once, then twice. And then Benny stood, one slow step, then another, until he reached the iron gate. He lifted one paw, not touching it, just hovering in the air, but it was a gesture rich with meaning. The same way Orion had once placed his paw on the bars the day Emily walked by. No one said a word. Jonas laid a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. He just picked his successor. Orion lifted his head, gaze still on Benny. His ears weren't upright and alert like when he was on duty. They rested gently, conveying calm, assurance, trust. There was no training here, no title. Only something unteachable, something that could only be passed down by one who had truly known the ache of waiting. Benny didn't need an introduction. He had just been acknowledged. Emily turned to Maggie. "Let's start introducing Benny to the outreach visits. No rush, just let him step outside." Maggie nodded, her eyes still wet. When they turned back, Orion was already standing. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. He simply walked toward the exit, quietly, steadily, like one who had completed his part in a cycle far greater than any mission or manual. Behind him, Benny remained, silent, unmoving. The gate hadn't opened, but the trust had. And in that brief moment between two generations of dogs once labeled difficult to bond, an invisible thread was woven. Not from a leash, but from a duty inherited through quiet resilience. That Sunday morning held no tours, no public schedule, just a winding road leading north, toward a place marked long ago by a fading red dot on an old map. And in Jonas's heart, a silence that had never quite closed. He opened a drawer and pulled out a weathered manila envelope. One corner was singed, a crease folded long ago. On its front, in slightly slanted handwriting, 781 Franklin Hill, Western Sector Outpost, Guard Unit Number. 7 inches Orion stood by the door. He didn't wag his tail, didn't react like he did on ordinary outings. He simply looked at Jonas, the way one does when something was left behind. And it's finally time to return for it. They set off before the sun had fully risen. The road to the old outpost had long since become an overgrown trail, blanketed in fallen leaves and creeping roots. Where once a signpost had stood, now only a few crooked wooden stakes remained, draped in moss and silence. Jonas slowed the pickup truck with each curve, as though each bend in the path mirrored the tension between hope and dread inside him. Near the final turn, Orion stirred. His ears tilted forward, nose twitching gently, eyes fixed beyond the glass. Jonas didn't ask. He simply killed the engine, opened the door, and together they stepped out. The winter base had once stood nestled between 2 low ridge lines. After the explosion that night, it had been left behind. Abandoned. No one ever came back. Jonas had once convinced himself the fire had consumed everything: equipment, the tiny mess hall, and Orion. Now only the blackened skeleton of the main lodge remained. Wild grass pushed up between cracked cement. The rusted flagpole leaned toward the trees, and the wind that whispered through the mountain pass carried the echoes of things that once were, but were no longer spoken of. Orion walked ahead. No frantic sniffing, no sprinting, just slow, deliberate steps. He remembered this place, every stone, every bend, every tree where frost once lingered during early patrols. He paused on the old floor, where there had once been a wooden bed frame and a threadbare rug where Jonas used to lie reading in off hours. Jonas followed, heart heavy. He had believed, needed to believe, that the night of the fire had been the end. He had stood by the river's edge afterward, imagining Orion running, trapped, unable to escape the flames, and had cut the thread of hope himself, because it was easier to mourn a certainty than bear the ache of not knowing. And yet here they stood. Orion, alive, strong, waiting, not because he was commanded, but because he always had, always knew. Jonas stepped into the ruins, not to find what had been lost, but to witness what remained. The outpost, once their haven through bitter snow seasons, was now a foundation, charred and hollow. A few bricks clung to ash, and the doorframe leaned broken like an unfinished sentence. Orion stayed beside him. No fear, no hesitation. He walked to the spot where a small wooden cabinet once stood beside the old fireplace, where Jonas had kept rewards after every training session. Usually a red rubber ball, Orion's favorite. Whenever he was released from duty, Orion would chase it in loops, playfully tossing it to himself like a pup let loose. Now, the cabinet was only a warped frame, half collapsed. Jonas knelt and lifted a scorched board. Under a thin layer of soot, something round. Burnt on one side, but still recognizable. Part of the ball. The red had faded, one side scorched black. But the grooved pattern was intact, even the small dent from Orion's tooth still etched into the rubber. Jonas didn't pick it up at first. He stared at it, almost as if unsure whether it was a memory, or a small miracle risen from the ashes. Orion approached. He didn't touch the ball. He simply sat beside Jonas, eyes fixed on it, not as if it were a toy, but something sacred. A silent salute to a time that once lived here. Jonas finally reached out. He lifted the ball gently with both hands, raising it to eye level, not to reminisce, but to acknowledge. Some things we thought the fire had taken still carry the imprint of who we were, because memory doesn't burn all the way through. Jonas tilted his head, half smiling, half choking. You remember this, don't you? Orion tilted his head too. One ear twitched. His gaze stayed on the ball. He didn't bark, didn't move. And then he inhaled and exhaled, soft, deep, like a silent period at the end of a 6-year sentence. Jonas looked around. No roof, no carpet, no fire-warmed stone. But something remained. A soul who had survived, who had held on to every cell of memory and returned, not to reclaim anything, but to close the chapter the right way. In the hollow remains of the lodge, the wind returned. This time, not with ash, but with the scent of new pine, of what might grow again, from what once seemed lost. The afternoon unraveled like film in reverse. Jonas sat on the cracked slab that once formed the front stoop, where he used to place Orion's water bowl each morning. Now it was just chipped cement, moss growing along the edges. Orion lay beside him, head resting on Jonas's leg, not asleep, not moving, only present, as if he knew this moment must not be broken. Jonas held the half-burnt rubber ball in his hand. The wind tousled his hair, carrying the faint scent of old scorched plastic and damp forest soil alive with roots. The old outpost, once the beginning of everything, now stood wrapped in a veil of mist and memory, drifting quietly in the golden haze of late afternoon light. Jonas bowed his head, fingers tightening around the burned rubber ball. I used to think you didn't make it out that night. His voice was low, hoarse, no longer the steady cadence it once carried. I blamed myself. Thought I should have come back, should have dug through every inch of rubble until I found even a single strand of fur, a mark of your paw. Orion didn't stir, but his breathing stayed steady, deep, unhurried, as if he were listening, absorbing each word that spilled from Jonas's chest like a river long dammed. Jonas looked out toward the clearing in the woods, where once the fireplace glowed red through blizzards and bone-deep silence. But the truth is, I didn't just lose you in the fire. His voice caught, then softened. I lost myself too. Orion shifted slightly, pressing the crown of his head gently against Jonas's leg. Not forcefully, not urgently. Just enough to anchor the man to this moment, to pull him back from the edge of all he hadn't forgiven himself for. Jonas placed a hand on Orion's back, his whole palm firm and quiet, feeling the warmth beneath his fingertips. Not like a miracle, but like a truth rediscovered. One he was finally learning to trust again. But you, he said, a faint smile catching in the lines of his face. You didn't just survive. He paused, eyes locking with the rich brown gaze that had once met him in firelight, in snowstorms, and even behind a cage labeled too old to be wanted. You led me out of the dark. There was no more to say. There was no need. The wind played gently through the trees. The evening sun reached long across the broken timbers, like a hand from the past, touching the shoulder of the one who remained. Jonas closed his eyes, and for the first time, in the place that had once witnessed only loss, he didn't feel empty anymore. Because some things, like loyalty, like patience, like a German shepherd named Orion, don't just survive the fire. They become the light that helps someone else find their way home. 1 week after returning to the old outpost, Jonas received a call from Emily. No greetings, no preamble. Just one simple question. Have you ever thought about turning that place into a beginning instead of an ending? Jonas didn't answer right away. He was standing on the porch, watching the sunset spill gold over the graying fur of Orion, curled quietly at his feet. The wind stirred a few old maps he had spread across the wooden table. "I've submitted a land use request," Emily continued. "The property belongs to a bank now. I think we can negotiate." A few days later, they stood together before the old wooden gate. It was no longer a military outpost, no longer a monument to loss. It was just land, open, waiting, ready to become something new. The foundation still remained. The old fireplace was stained with soot, but the ground had healed, grass growing wild between cracked stones, dotted with nameless wildflowers blooming without permission. Emily placed a hand on one of the broken fence posts. Her eyes held a light that wasn't nostalgia, but resolve. "I don't want to rebuild a house," she said softly. "I want to create a resting place for the ones no one's waiting for, but who still deserve a warm roof above them." Weeks later, the first hand-carved wooden sign was placed at the entrance of the narrow path leading into the valley. "The Watchdog's Haven, a place where the last guardians can finally rest." The name wasn't Emily's. It was Jonas's suggestion, because Orion had once stood guard, because Max had once led the way, because hundreds of working dogs, trained to protect others, were eventually forgotten, left behind when they grew too old, too weak, or simply too much. This wouldn't be a kennel, not a shelter, and certainly not a business. The Watchdog's Haven was designed as a retirement sanctuary, a refuge for dogs no longer able to work, but still full of life and presence. A large cabin was built from repurposed wood, sun-warmed porches, soft mats laid along the corridors, individual dining areas customized for age and dietary needs. To the south, a small pond where dogs could soak in the summer heat. Jonas sketched the layout himself. Emily brought in a volunteer vet. Neighbors, upon hearing the news, began sending supplies, bags of food, old blankets, insulation foam. Some came with handwritten notes. "For a four-legged friend who once knew cold, may you finally know warmth." Orion never left the site in those early days. He lay right in the middle of the central deck, watching each timber raised, each nail driven. He didn't need to read the blueprints. He could feel it. This time, no one would be left behind. And in a valley once meant to mark an ending, Jonas and Emily began writing a new chapter. Not for themselves, but for those silent souls who had guarded the world without anyone ever noticing. When the sign, "The Watchdog's Haven," was finally mounted on the entry gate, autumn had just begun. Yellow leaves drifted over the newly pebbled paths, and the maple trees lining the pond glowed deep crimson. The first dogs didn't come from shelters. They came from emergency overflow kennels, from to-be euthanized lists, from isolation wings, where their only crime was being too old, too sick, or too forgotten. Each dog carried a story, but no one asked about the past once they crossed into the haven. Here, they were given new names, sometimes picked by volunteers. There was Murphy, almost 12, with a stiff limp, who loved basking in the morning sun. Della, her eyes milky, once abandoned behind a shuttered house, now rested near a record player playing soft classical music. And Orion, he remained the heartbeat of it all. Though his steps were slower now, his presence was unshakable. Each morning, he made his rounds, visiting the dining area, the main cabin, and the sun porch. He never barked, never gave orders, but his presence was like a lantern that never went out, quiet, steady, enough to help weary souls feel safe again. Emily began a handwritten journal, logging every dog welcomed home. Beside each name were 3 columns: favorite food, greatest fear, reaction to their name. Each page was tenderly written, with personal notes in the margins. Cooper flinches at the sound of keys, now calmer when Orion is near. Mimi never used to sleep, now loves curling beside the yellow lamp with soft guitar music. Jonas built a small bamboo pergola in the garden where he and Emily could sit each evening, reading, sipping tea, watching their four-legged veterans doze in the grass. There were no fences, no chains, just gentle footsteps, and the peaceful sighs of beings who, for the first time in their lives, were allowed to simply rest. A few weeks later, a group of school children came for a visit. When one of them asked, "Is this a place where old dogs are kept?" Emily simply smiled and replied, "No. This is where dogs once left behind get to be themselves again." And a fourth-grade boy, after spending 30 quiet minutes with a blind dog named Jet, pinned a small note on the corkboard by the gate, written in pencil. "Here, they don't wait for owners anymore. They have friends." That was enough. No need for brochures. Because in a world obsessed with speed and usefulness, the quiet existence of a green hill reserved for those once labeled no longer worth anything was a rarity worth preserving. The watchdog's haven was never built to save every dog. It exists so that no dog has to die feeling unloved. That afternoon, while Jonas was organizing the intake medical records for new arrivals, a plain white envelope slipped from the mailbox nailed to the front gate. No stamp, no return address. Only a line written in blue ink, slanted slightly, "To the one caring for Orion." He opened the letter just as the sun dipped behind the western trees. Orion lay beside him, head resting quietly on the porch steps, just like always. Jonas read slowly. Each word peeled him away from the present and into a stranger's memory that somehow felt closer than most people he knew. "My name is Clara. When I was around 9, my father brought home a German shepherd for my birthday. He was small, soft, and so intelligent that my mother once said, 'He doesn't look like a dog, he looks like a child who's listening.' I named him Bear because he looked more like a plush toy than a proper guard dog. Bear walked me to school, slept by my feet, and was the first face I saw every morning. Back then, I thought nothing could ever separate us. But my parents divorced. We lost our home. Bear was sent away. Just for a little while, they said. But truth is, I never saw him again. I searched, used his name, asked relatives, but no one keeps records of a puppy with no chip, no paperwork, no registration. I used to dream. If we met again, would Bear still remember me? But after a few years, I stopped asking. I stopped remembering how he curled into a circle when he slept, or how he'd growl softly whenever I snuck food without sharing. Then one day, I saw Orion in a photo from a shared post. I wasn't sure, but that close-up, those eyes, I recognized them instantly. Not because of his shape, but because of the way he looked into the camera. Just like the last time Bear looked at me. He didn't chase after the car. He didn't bark. He just sat on the porch, understanding, but not blaming. I didn't write then. I was afraid of bothering anyone, afraid people would think I wanted him back. But no, I don't. I'm writing only to say, if Orion was once Bear, thank you. Thank you for keeping him alive, not just breathing, but truly alive. Thank you for loving him the way I once wished I could and can no longer do. I don't need to have him again. Just knowing he's safe is enough. Clara. When Jonas folded the letter, Orion was still beside him. He placed a hand on the shepherd's back, not to comfort him, but to affirm something Clara had written. Orion hadn't just survived all these years. He had lived well. He had honored the love once given to him, even the kind that had been forgotten long ago. And sometimes, a letter doesn't carry a plea for reunion. It carries a blessing, meant for both the sender and the soul they once lost. After Clara's letter, more began to arrive. Not many, not all at once. They came like quiet winds, carrying echoes from lives once touched by the name Orion, and never quite the same again. The first was from a man named Reese Mallory, written by hand on yellowed paper. It read, "I visited Shelter Haven 3 years ago. Wanted to adopt an older dog. Puppies were too much for my household. I stood in front of Orion's kennel for nearly 10 minutes. He just sat there, straight-backed, didn't jump, didn't whine. I remember thinking, this one's hard to bond with. So I turned to the next kennel, chose a different dog. That one passed away months later from a heart condition. But I never forgot Orion's eyes when I walked away. They didn't beg, they didn't accuse, they just understood. When I learned about him recently, I cried. Not from guilt, but from relief. The world had found a way to give him another chance. I can't undo what I didn't do, but please allow me to send a small monthly donation to the Watchdog's Haven. And if there's ever a dog who waits the way Orion once waited, please don't let them wait that long again." The second letter arrived in neatly printed, feminine handwriting, accompanied by a colored photograph. A little girl smiling, her hair now longer, reading a book aloud to another dog at a local rescue shelter. "I'm Abby's mom. We used to think therapy dogs were just a trend, unnecessary, maybe even performative. But ever since Orion found our daughter, that belief changed. I'll never forget the moment Abby, shy, withdrawn Abby, suddenly lit up when talking about her four-legged hero. She said, 'Orion didn't find me. Orion chose me.' Now, every Saturday, Abby visits the shelter to read books to dogs waiting for adoption. She always chooses the ones who are injured or blind and whispers into their ears, 'You could be the next Orion.'" And then came a letter from a veteran recovery center in Idaho. No name, only the initials TS signed with a single paragraph. "I spent 11 months in a psychological rehab camp. I don't remember the doctors' faces. I don't remember meal times. But I remember a dog named Orion who never intruded on my nightmares, only sat there quietly. Every time panic set in, Orion would just tilt his head, and I'd know I hadn't lost everything. I lost my comrades, my words, my trust in people. But Orion helped me believe again. Not with words, but with presence. I don't know what else to write. Just, if I'm still alive to pen this, then maybe he's the first reason why." Each letter was a milestone, not to glorify Orion, but to prove a simple truth. That loyalty, when paired with patience, becomes a fire that warms others, even when you no longer need its light yourself. And Orion, the dog who once sat silently behind a cage for 6 years, had lived a life worthy of letters, written just to say, "Thank you for existing." That day the sky was crystal clear. The ground was dry, no mist, not a single cloud, just sunlight pouring through the trees like a sheer veil draped over the quiet space of Haven. The grass felt soft underfoot. The lake mirrored the wings of birds gliding above. Elderly dogs dozed across the wooden deck, bellies full from breakfast. Orion lay among them, in his favorite eastern corner, where the morning sun hit warmest at this hour. Jonas sat nearby, a half-read book resting on his lap, though his eyes no longer followed the words. Orion wasn't asleep. But he wasn't fully awake either. He lay on his side, breathing slow and steady, head resting on Jonas's shin, just like he had since the day they reunited. Yet something was different. Not weaker, just lighter. As if each breath carried nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to wait for, only quiet circles dissolving into the air. Jonas didn't speak. He sensed the shift not from Orion's posture, but from the fading rhythm of the heart he could feel beneath the thick fur at his nape. His hand lowered, palm gently pressing against that familiar shoulder, not to keep him, but to say goodbye. The way one holds a loved one's hand when they know. It's time to let go. "You're okay, aren't you?" he asked softly, without expecting an answer. Orion opened his eyes. Slow, lazy, but strangely peaceful, the gaze of a guardian who had completed his final watch and was now being released, after all those years without asking for anything in return. A breeze drifted past. Gentle, not cold. The other dogs seemed to feel it too. A few lifted their heads. A few moved closer and lay nearby. No sound, no disruption. Just presence, companionship. And when the sunbeam reached the tip of Orion's nose, he stirred, ever so slightly, as if nodding. His head slipped gently off Jonas's leg, settling on the warm wood, perfectly still, as if he had chosen the right place to stop. His last breath, if you could call it that, was not quite a breath. It was a wisp of mist, vanishing into the wind. Jonas didn't cry. He didn't call out, didn't shake him. He simply leaned down, placed a hand over Orion's chest, and nodded. "Yeah, so, it's time, huh?" He sat there like that for nearly an hour, beside a soul who had walked his entire journey in the quietest, most graceful way possible. No urgent tears, no sad soundtrack, just a man and a dog who had walked through darkness together when no one else believed there was light left. And when one of them left, the other didn't collapse. He simply sat, grateful. Not a single dog barked. Usually when someone entered the sanctuary, or when a door creaked open, barks would rise like reflex, residue of animals taught to stay wary of the world. But that afternoon, when Orion stopped breathing, not a sound broke the silence. There was no chorus of barks, no sudden cries, only the rustle of wind threading through pine trees and the hush of grass swaying like a lullaby. Emily arrived just as the sun dipped behind the hill. She didn't ask anything. One glance at Jonas, sitting motionless, hand resting on Orion's back, the last light of day brushing against the dog's silvered fur, and she understood. She knelt beside him, gently touched the forehead of the dog who had passed, and whispered, "Thank you, old friend." There were no tears spilling over. Emily's eyes were red, but they didn't overflow. Some farewells weren't meant to hurt. They were meant to complete, like a well-timed rest note in a long symphony. Jonas slowly unbuckled Orion's collar. He smoothed down the fur around the neck, then placed the collar into his palm, gazing at it for a long moment. This object had once encircled a being who never left before his time. Now it lay still, not functional, but sacred, like an unspoken medal. The entire sanctuary fell into a hush. The other dogs, whether lying still or pacing the grounds, seemed to move with a rhythm so quiet it defied explanation. Perhaps it needed none. Perhaps souls like theirs communicated in a language deeper than sound, where one who had just departed left not confusion, but a soft, lingering light. After sunset, Jonas and Emily wrapped Orion in a beige blanket, the same one he always chose on cold winter nights. There was no funeral, no media announcement, just a small grave dug behind the maple tree, the one where Orion had spent most of his twilight hours. Emily didn't carve stone. She simply placed a small wooden plaque, handwritten with a single line. He didn't leave. He simply rested. And when night fell, under a sky drenched in stars, the haven remained as it always was, quiet and whole. There was no wailing, no dramatic grief, only peace, clear as a lake's surface and deep as silent affection. Orion had lived a life without hurry, without demands, without overshadowing others. And he left in that same way, softly, like the last breath of a soul who had learned how to wait, and was finally allowed to let go. That winter, as the pine trees around the watchdog's haven began to harden, and the wind carried the scent of old earth down from the hills, Emily published the first book of her life. The cover was simple, earth-toned, raw, no images, no embellishments, just a single title pressed into the center, The Watcher. Beneath it, a smaller line, a true story about the dog who waited 2,000 days, and then led the world back to trust. The author's name wasn't hers alone, by Emily Tran and Jonas Hale, not because Jonas had written it, but because to Emily, no one understood Orion's soul more than the man who had once been pulled out of the dark by the gentlest silence she had ever known. The book was not a memoir, nor a typical biography. It was a collection of vignettes, not linear, but like clusters of memory placed side by side for readers to piece together into a full portrait. One chapter held only brief dialogues between Jonas and Orion, recorded from memory. Another described how Orion walked each morning, with no particular aim, yet never once seeming lost. Another was simply composed of letters received at the sanctuary, quiet reflections behind large, unseen things. There were no climaxes, no chases, no torrents of tears, only slow steps and a patience that carried a life gently across time. In the prologue, Emily wrote, "Some dogs are born to bark, some are born to run. Orion was born to wait, not because he couldn't do anything else, but because waiting was his mission. And in this world, few have the courage to sit still until the very end." The book was published by a small independent press, initially limited to 500 copies, intended for community libraries, elementary schools, and veteran recovery centers. But within 3 weeks, The Watcher was shared by thousands, from elderly people who had raised dogs their entire lives, to children hearing for the first time about healing through presence, from psychology teachers to shelter workers. They didn't post reviews, only excerpts that stayed with them. Orion doesn't make you believe in miracles. He makes you believe that sometimes living quietly is enough to change the world. Page 78. No one ever asked what Orion wanted, but by being exactly where he was at the exact time, he showed us what we needed most. Page 112. Jonas didn't speak at the book launch. He simply attended, standing quietly at the back of the small hall. Orion wasn't there, but his photo, taken from behind, seated and gazing out at the sanctuary gate, was enlarged and displayed up front. Emily's voice was steady, but soft. "Orion didn't write this book, but he taught me how to write every line of it. And if you're reading this, I hope you remember one thing. Kindness doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to last long enough." From the earliest days of building the Watchdog's Haven, Jonas once said something no one ever wrote down, but everyone remembered. "If Orion ever leaves, I don't want him buried in memory. I want him to become something people can see, whenever they need a reason not to give up." And that promise was kept. 3 months after Orion's passing, a bronze statue was completed. It wasn't placed in the center courtyard. It had no colored lights, no ceremonial ribbons. It simply stood, quietly, in the exact spot Orion used to sit every afternoon, on the old wooden porch, where he watched the whispering pines and the small lake catching the sky's reflection. The statue wasn't tall, barely 80 centimeters, but it was carved with exquisite detail, down to the last strand of fur. The artist, a veteran who had once stayed at the recovery camp, refused any payment. He only asked for one thing. "Let me touch that back, one last time, with my own hands." The statue didn't show Orion baring teeth or standing proud. No aggression, no tension. He was simply sitting, ears slightly back, eyes gazing out, head tilted just a little, his body leaning forward, mirroring the exact posture he held during those 6 long years behind a metal gate. Not pleading, not begging, but waiting. The pedestal was made of repurposed pine from Jonas's old outpost cabin. On it, a small brass plaque read, "Orion, the one who waited." Visitors to the haven often paused before the statue. No one spoke much. Some children rested their hands gently on his head. A few older veterans left single flowers. Some sat quietly for a while, then rose as if they'd just passed through a silent ritual of healing. Emily once recounted a moment when an 8-year-old boy, new to town, grieving the loss of his own dog, sat beside the statue for 20 minutes. When his mother asked why, the boy simply said, "I don't know why. But here, it doesn't feel sad anymore." The statue never tarnished in the rain or sun. Perhaps it was the special alloy, or perhaps it didn't need to change. Orion had once lived like a silent mirror, and now he remained so, still quiet, simply present, so others could steady themselves to move forward. That statue wasn't built to memorialize a dog. It was built to remind us. In everyone who's ever waited, longing quietly, there's a part of Orion. Still, patient, never lost, only waiting to be seen. That afternoon wasn't perfectly clear, nor gloomy. The sun wasn't bright, but warm enough to catch on the white daisies blooming along the southern porch. A breeze from the lake carried the scent of young pine and the soft crackle of firewood burning in the hearth near the glass doors. Jonas sat alone. In the old wooden chair, beside a cup of tea gone cold. The house wasn't quiet because it was empty. It was quiet because some silences are meant to be kept. In front of him lay the 37th floor tile, a tile no different in shape or color from the rest, yet bearing something no other piece did. Its surface was hand-etched with a line, small but unmistakable. Never too late, never too lost, always needed. It was the final sentence Jonas had written, the night before laying the tile into the exact spot where Orion had always sat. Head resting on Jonas's leg, eyes watching children on the grass or other dogs passing by without needing to say a word. Jonas placed his hand over the tile, weathered palm pressing against the cool stone. Not to find warmth, but as if leaving something behind, not loss, not regret, but a final whisper. You never had to try to be anything, Orion. You already were what the world needed, even before it knew it. No response came. None was needed. A gentle breeze lifted the hem of Jonas's coat. On the lawn, the statue of the one who waited remained seated, calm. And farther out, under the tree line, a few old dogs dozed in the shade, as if this place had always been home. Jonas pulled a small paper slip from his pocket, the original draft of the inscription on the tile. He read it one last time, then folded it carefully and tucked it into a crevice beside the stone. But he didn't rise. He simply sat, eyes half closed, hand resting in the place where Orion once laid his head. And in the final slant of sunlight from a quiet day, he said nothing more. Because some stories don't need endings. They just need a place to stay, and a heart to keep living in. The story of Orion is not merely the journey of a dog once forgotten. It is a gentle reminder that patience and presence, when given freely and without demand, can offer more salvation than any grand gesture. The German Shepherd, with its intelligence, loyalty, and tireless nature, is more than a trained animal. It is a companion, a witness to trust, a soul that knows how to wait and how to love, with a kind of love that asks for nothing. Orion was once overlooked, but he chose to stay, not to be seen, but to remind the world that every life, no matter how old or scarred, deserves a chance to live fully once again. If you're reading these words, then perhaps you too carry a part of Orion in your heart. The kind part, the quiet part, the one that doesn't demand light, but radiates it anyway. So love deliberately. Pay close attention to the quiet things around you. And if you can, open your heart to a dog who's still waiting for someone not to turn away, the way Orion once waited. because love, when held long enough, is never forgotten. That morning was colder than usual. Mist still clung to the windshield when the old truck rolled over the red dirt path that led to the rescue center. Gravel cracked beneath its tires with a dry, brittle sound, merging with faint, distant barks that echoed like a sparse and wary chorus. In the back of the truck sat a rusted steel cage, bound by two fraying ropes. Inside, curled into a tight ball among rust stains and damp cloth, a thin, withered creature trembled, as if even the air brushing against it could cause pain. The driver stopped, opened his door, but didn't move forward. He only lifted his eyes towards the man standing quietly on the steps. Michael Turner, the longtime manager of the center, stood under the pale, reluctant sunlight of dawn. He didn't speak. He just walked slowly towards the truck, gave a slight nod, and motioned for the driver to unlock the cage. The door creaked open. The creature inside didn't move. It didn't growl. It didn't bark. It didn't resist. It simply retreated deeper into the shadows, into the furthest corner where light couldn't reach, where its existence seemed to dissolve into darkness itself. Once that coat might have been the pride of a German shepherd. Now it hung in patchy clumps, exposing a raw, scarred hide beneath. Its ears lay flat against its skull, eyes half open, blank, like a still lake reflecting nothing but memories already drowned. "What's his name?" Michael asked. The driver just shrugged. "No idea. When we picked him up from the compound, nobody called him anything. They just scribbled something on his metal tag. K-21. Michael exhaled slowly. He had seen enough souls pulled from hell to know what rock bottom looked like. But this creature, no, not a creature, a soul, made him question whether pain had a limit after all. "Put him in the isolated kennel," he said quietly, as if afraid to disturb the shadow wrapped tightly around that fragile body. By midday, the rescue center had come alive. Footsteps echoed through the halls. Children's laughter bounced across the walls. Dogs barked as they chased butterflies across the field. But none of those sounds reached the far end of the corridor, where K-21 remained locked away in a silence so dense it seemed to hush the air itself. No one dared come close. Even seasoned volunteers couldn't cross within 2 meters without feeling their chests tighten, as if his fear had a shape, as if it wielded invisible blades that carved through the very space around him. Except for one person. She didn't arrive with force, didn't speak loudly, didn't pretend to be brave. She came like a breeze, gentle, unannounced, unquestioning. Solace. No one knew her real name. They simply called her that because from the day she arrived, wherever there was a whimper, she was there. Wherever there were eyes dimmed with hopelessness, she sat with them. Not to talk, just to be there. That day was the first time she heard about the creature called K-21. Michael didn't need to explain much. She understood, not through his words, but through the silence that hung in his gaze toward the isolated kennel. She walked down that hallway, her fabric shoes brushing against old concrete, leaving behind footsteps that didn't echo. She stopped at the cage. She didn't reach through the bars, didn't call his name, didn't tempt him with food. She simply stood. Then slowly, she sat. Hands on her knees, back against the wall, her eyes resting, not to pierce, not to pry, just to share the space. In the shadows, the creature, still nameless, opened his eyes. He didn't growl, but his breathing shifted. His ribs trembled like strings struck out of tune. The light angled through the bars, tracing over the bones beneath his thinning coat. But in his eyes, those eyes, there was something. something barely there like a mist, not hope, but something that resisted despair. Solace said nothing. She simply stayed. An hour passed, then 2. The sun began to slip behind the rooftop. Volunteers passing by gave her puzzled looks. She didn't move. Michael returned once, arms folded as he stood at the end of the hall, watching silently. At last, he asked, "You think he understands?" Solace tilted her head, not toward him, and answered softly, as if speaking to the wind. "I don't need him to understand. I just need him to know I won't leave." Michael stood quietly for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. He didn't speak again. As twilight descended, the center settled into quiet. A few dogs curled into sleep. Others turned toward the dim glow from the office window. But down that corridor, in front of an old steel cage, one figure remained seated. And inside, the nameless German shepherd stayed curled in his shadow. He hadn't stepped forward, but he no longer closed his eyes. He watched. And that was the first moment of the longest journey of his life. No one dared come near, until she did. Not to touch, but to simply be. The hallway glowed gold in the slanting light, stretching out like a long, slow breath. Wind drifted gently through the small grated window at the corridor's end, carrying the scent of earth, rusted iron, and a weary silence too tired to speak. Courage, the name not yet spoken aloud, still lay curled in place. But now his head had shifted slightly, just enough to face the light. But the eyes were open, no longer shut tight as before, no longer shying from the light as if it might sear them by the mere presence of another's gaze. Solace sat there, as though she had never left, her back still against the wall, her hands resting atop her knees, wordless and motionless, as if her very breath had folded into the air around them, careful not to disturb the fragile thing that hovered between them, delicate enough that even a blink might shatter it. Courage's eyes, deep brown tinged with shadow, did not meet hers. They looked through her, past her, to some faraway place, somewhere ancient. That gaze held no coldness, no fear. It was empty, like a room long forgotten where a fire once burned but no longer did, a quiet dark, free of hatred, absent of violence, but stripped of trust all the same. She knew those eyes, not because she had seen many painful eyes in her life, though she had, but because those eyes did not see her as a person. They saw her as a potential threat, as the echo of some unseen lash still imprinted in the recesses of memory. Courage wasn't looking at her. He was looking back, at something that had stolen from him the right to believe, the right to live as something that once knew how to be alive. "He doesn't blink," said a deep voice from behind her. Michael Turner appeared, coffee cup cold in his hand, jacket casually slung over his shoulder. He walked forward without urgency, as if he knew that any sudden motion in this moment might fracture what was most breakable, like wet glass barely holding form. Solace didn't answer. She remained still, eyes following that pair of pupils, her breathing slow and steady, almost syncing with the rhythm of Courage's heart, if his heart still remembered how to beat as it once did. "He had a name once," Michael said, not as a declaration, but as a sliver of memory peeled from a rain-warped, crumpled page of some old file. Solace turned her head slightly. "Before he came here?" she asked, voice soft enough to go no farther than it needed. "Yes. He was born in an illegal puppy mill on the western outskirts, over 40 dogs, crammed into cages too small to stretch their legs, feces mixed into their drinking water. The only light was the thin beam of sun cutting through rusted tin roofing. and the only hands that touched them were the ones that dragged them out. For forced breeding. Solace closed her eyes. Not from shock, but because what Michael described sounded like a tune she'd heard too many times before. And still, every time it played, it froze the skin on her arms with the same familiar chill. "How long was he in the cage?" she asked. 4 years, Michael replied, taking a sip of cold coffee. 4 years without a name, no collar, no one calling for him, just commands. And pain. Courage did not hear that conversation, but somehow his ears twitched, a distant reflex, stirred by memory. "People often ask," Michael continued, "why dogs like him don't fight back. Why they don't bark, don't scratch, don't run. I always say, because they've gone past fear. They no longer believe that reacting changes anything. They no longer fight, because they no longer believe they deserve to live any differently." Solace still didn't look back at Michael, but her hand, resting on her knee, tightened slightly. She had seen that look many times, but in Courage it went deeper, as though what had been stolen wasn't just life, but the part of the soul that once cried out for help. "Was he ever held?" she asked suddenly. Michael didn't answer right away. Then, with a voice slow and soft as mist settling on cold rooftops, "I don't think he knows what it means to be held." Night had fallen. The hallway light spilled a dull haze across the old tiles. Solace remained there, unmoving, offering no comfort through touch or sweet whispers, because she understood. Souls like Courage did not need hands to pet them, or soft voices coaxing them into trust. They needed presence, a presence that was real, without condition, without demand, without expectation. Courage's gaze still stared outward, unblinking. But this time, instead of looking through her as if she were a pane of invisible glass, his eyes hesitated, for the briefest flicker, as though unsure. Not ready to trust, not yet. But perhaps beginning to recognize, that person is still there. That person hasn't left. Solace exhaled. Gently. "Good evening," she whispered, as if to the wind. In the kennel, Courage didn't move, but his ears twitched again. No one could say whether it was because of her voice, or because his own heartbeat had just unexpectedly changed its tune. And in his gaze, still dark, still deep as a chasm, for the first time there was something faint glimmering at the bottom. Not light, but existence. Quiet, but true. The next morning, Solace returned early. Haven Shelter had not yet opened. The volunteers had not arrived. The corridor lights still flickered faintly, as if the building itself had not quite awakened from the veil of fog that lingered around its tin roof, where droplets from the night still clung. The world around had not yet stirred. But she stood there, holding a lidded cup of hot coffee, warmth threading through her fingers. Not to warm herself, but as a silent ritual, a quiet readiness for a day no one could predict. No greetings, no stops, no glance at the schedule taped beside the door. She simply moved forward, like someone who already knew exactly where she needed to be, not to fix something broken, but to carry on something unfinished. Courage was still in the same corner, but his eyes were open. And when her silhouette entered his line of sight, though he didn't rise or shift toward her, he also didn't turn away. She sat down, just like the day before. She didn't call his name, because no one had ever called him by a real name. She didn't reach out a hand, because with wounds like his, distance wasn't something you crossed with eagerness. She simply sat. Hands folded on her knees, back resting against the wall, her gaze not pressing toward him, but always gently available, like a soft light left on in case someone lost in the dark might look for it. And so, she remained. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. Is she still there? Eliza, a young volunteer, spoke quietly behind Michael. She is, he answered, eyes still on the vaccine ledger, fingers flipping pages as if nothing noteworthy had been mentioned, though his glance lingered down the hall. Eliza sighed. I don't get it. I mean, what is she trying to do? Just sitting there. What's the point? Michael didn't respond at once. He set his pen down, lifted his head, and looked toward the slim figure at the far end of the corridor. Still seated, still unmoved, as if time had surrendered its power around her breath. Maybe the fact that she's doing nothing, he said softly, is exactly what he needs. Eliza frowned, unconvinced. Michael leaned on the wooden counter, letting out a slow breath. There are wounds no medicine can touch. No warm meal or tight embrace can close them. There are wounds, his voice dipped low, that only begin to heal when someone is willing to stay, with no reason and no end goal. Afternoon settled in. Clouds stretched thin across the sky, dimming the light as wind slipped through the cracks, carrying with it the hush of a day slowly dimming. Solace was still there. And inside the cage, Courage did not sleep. He no longer curled like a forsaken child. His front legs stretched gently forward. His head, still low, rested but not buried. Now and then his eyes would flutter shut, then open again, and each time they drifted toward Solace. Not searching, not hoping, but something quieter than both. An early flicker of awareness, a newborn reflex just beginning to take shape, barely formed but carrying the gravity of recognition. Someone is still here. Has she eaten? Another staffer, Ryan, asked as Michael stepped out of his office. Michael shook his head. She brought some bread, but I haven't seen her touch it. Been there since morning. Ryan sighed. We don't know what else to do. No one can get near him. Every time we try, he shakes like he's about to lose his heart. Michael looked at Ryan for a long time. Then quietly. Maybe doing nothing is the only thing that might save him. The sun dipped early. The air turned cold. Shadows crept up the wall, swallowing each tile in silence. A few dogs barked, not at anything in particular, but like reflexes echoing a wordless song about a passing afternoon. Solace didn't move. People began to call her strange. Some said she was wasting time. Others worried she'd wear herself out for nothing. And Courage, he still didn't rise, but he no longer looked away. Now, instead of flinching, he lay still. And watched her, unblinking, not trusting, but not turning either. Solace looked back, and on her lips a smile appeared, so small it could barely be called one, not of triumph, not of happiness, but something gentler, like a quiet thank you whispered into a space that hadn't held warmth in a long time. Because that gaze, even if nothing more than a single thread across a room lined with fear, was a step, a breath, a beginning. At 8 o'clock, as the center began to close and voices faded behind shut doors, Michael walked once again to the end of the corridor. Solace was still there, exactly where she had been since morning. You planning to sit there forever? He asked gently. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were still on Courage, now resting with his eyes closed, no longer trembling. I don't know how long is enough, she said, but I believe one day he'll come out. Not for me, but for himself. Michael looked at her. His eyes, trained over the years by protocol, shaped by metrics and schedules, softened just slightly. You know, he murmured, his voice husky like dusk, I used to think no one could save a soul that had forgotten what it felt like to be touched without pain. But maybe It's because you didn't try to save him that you might actually be doing just that." Solace turned her head and offered a faint smile. "Doing nothing," she repeated. "Sometimes it's the only way someone doesn't feel forced to live." And as night wrapped its arms around the building, when every sound had sunk back into the bones of the old walls, only two beings remained, one seated, one lying in shadow, separated by steel, bound by presence. Neither moved, neither spoke. Only patience breathed between them, and something quietly began to grow. Something the world often forgets still exists. Trust. Not born from persuasion, but from the courage it takes to simply stay. The next morning, sunlight pierced the misted window panes, drawing golden lines across each weathered step. A new day began like any other at the rescue center, marked by barks, rattling bowls, and voices calling from the vaccine room to the feed shed. But at the very last corridor, where there were no bells, no names, no expectations for improvement, something unseen was unfolding. A moment so quiet, it went unnoticed. Solace arrived early, like a ritual that needed no announcement. She still wore that gray sweater, frayed at the sleeves, still wore those worn shoes, still carried her coffee to warm her hands. Nothing different, nothing loud, as if she too had become a part of the wall, the floor, the shifting light across the old bench. And courage still lay in his cage, his corner of shadow where he had remained unseen for days. But today, just as Solace eased her back to the wall, folded her legs, and exhaled, not fast, not slow, something shifted. It was small. A single ear, once pressed tightly to his skull, as if to shut out all sound and thought, lifted just slightly, like the first leaf stirred by wind. No one stood close enough to witness it. No cameras captured it. No soundtrack swelled. No narration unfolded. There was only Solace, and the rhythm of her own breath, bearing witness with one of the deepest faculties a human being can possess, that quiet tremor in the soul when, after countless still days, another soul releases its first fragile exhale of survival. Courage's ear moved. Barely. Then, his nose, dry and pale from too many days of ignoring scent, twitched, not quite to smell, but as if stirred by an incomplete reflex, a flicker of instinctive memory reaching beyond the barricades, brushing the edge of a world where wind could still be felt without fear of confinement. Solace didn't move. But her heart missed a beat. No one else would know. But she did. She had sat there through too many days to count, not because she expected this moment to come, but because she believed that if stillness was deep enough, if presence was quiet enough, then even the deepest wounds would eventually reach a single instant, just one, when the soul on the other side of the fracture would part slightly, creating the smallest aperture through which to breathe. And when that moment came, nothing must be done to seal it shut again. She didn't react. She didn't smile. She didn't speak his name. She simply remained, breath steady, as if the rhythm of her life no longer belonged to her, but had aligned itself with courage, with the faint rekindling that had stirred inside a body once silenced by despair. The volunteers began to arrive. Eliza carried water to clean the bowls. Ryan unlocked the food supply. The usual noises spilled into the hallway: barks, the rattle of metal dishes, the creak and click of kennel doors. A morning soundtrack familiar to anyone who spent time here. But Solace didn't hear those sounds. She heard something else, the sound reserved only for those who had waited long enough to be granted it, the sound of a creature trying to remember what it felt like to feel. Courage did not lift his head. He did not stretch. He didn't move from that spot. But something unmistakable had changed. He did not retreat into the shadows as before. His ears no longer pinned back. His nose still twitched faintly. His eyes remained open. And for the first time, they weren't gazing into emptiness. They were looking toward Solace. Not fully, not entirely, but undeniably. And in that gaze, there was no question, no recognition, not yet acceptance, only a quiet tracking, as if he were watching to see what she would do next. Not out of fear, but because perhaps he had begun to believe she might stay. Solace sat still. She didn't need to answer with action. Her inaction in that moment was the most honest response she could offer. By noon, the sunlight had changed. It poured golden like honey, spreading across the old floor tiles in jagged shapes. A few droplets spilled from a leaking pipe, shattering on contact, disappearing as if they had never existed. Michael walked by. He paused, looked at Solace, then looked at Courage. "I heard from Ryan. His ear moved, didn't it?" he asked. Solace didn't turn toward him, but she nodded gently. "And the nose?" Michael pressed, voice lower. "It twitched," she answered. "It didn't last long, but it was real." Michael smiled softly, not aloud, but like someone who had just heard something too fragile to call hope by name. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured, "how one ear lifting, one nose twitching, can make it feel like the whole world just shifted." Solace's fingers tightened around the rim of her now cold coffee. She didn't reply. Because she knew. Those who had never sat for hours beside a silent creature would never understand the weight of a single motion. But for her, it was enough. Enough to know Courage was whispering back to her, from the edge of the abyss, not with words, but with a pulse of life. And when afternoon came, when the sun withdrew its light from the walls and the wind carried the earthy scent of a fading season, Courage remained in place, unmoving. But his gaze did not waver. Each time Solace exhaled, he blinked, as if that was the only way he could say, "I am here. I haven't given up. No one else saw it." But Solace did. And for her, a twitching ear, a vibrating breath, and eyes that no longer closed were the first 3 chapters in the journal of coming back to life. A journal written not in ink, but in silence, in unmeasured heartbeats, in time that could never be counted. The next morning opened with a gentler light than usual. The sun did not rush to blaze across the compound, but stretched a thin sheet of gold through the trees outside the shelter's fence, as if it too had learned to be patient, so as not to break what was growing slowly, tentatively. Solace arrived. As always, without a word, without waiting to be summoned, without stopping by the office. Her steps made no distinct sound, yet somehow each one seemed to carry with it an unspoken vow. "I will sit here again, as I did yesterday, as I did the day before, and for however many days to come, if needed." Courage was awake. He had not returned to the shadows. He was not curled tight as he had been the first time she came. He lay in the center of the kennel floor, not too far, not too close, his head resting on his front paws, ears quietly attentive, eyes turned slightly in her direction. And for the first time, Solace brought something with her, a small cloth bundle, carefully wrapped. Inside was a piece of white chicken, gently boiled, no spices, no oils, no overwhelming scent. Just enough for a creature who had long forgotten the taste of life to recognize. "This is for me, not to bargain, not to lure, but to offer." She sat down, as gently as one would begin a ceremony. She unwrapped the cloth. Her hands didn't tremble, but something in her palms made her hold her breath, as if she knew that the moment to come, however small, might hold within it the turning point of all the hours, all the days, All the weeks spent waiting, Solace leaned forward and placed the chicken between herself and Courage. Not close enough to pressure, not distant enough to force him to cross a line he wasn't ready for. The piece of chicken touched the cool cement with the softness of a second whisper, this one not breathed but born of trust. And then, she did nothing more. Courage didn't move. Every muscle in his body remained taut, not relaxing, not easing, but his nose quivered. Not in the recoiling twitch of the day before, but in something deliberate, something conscious. He was truly smelling. The scent of cooked chicken, the scent of old cloth, the scent of the hand that had carried it through the long corridor. He didn't stretch, didn't crawl closer. But his nose kept moving. Slowly, cautiously, curiously. From the far side of the building, Eliza passed by, tray in hand, and paused as her eyes caught the moment at the end of the corridor. Solace, seated as always. Courage, looking toward the food. "She's trying to feed him now?" Eliza asked. Not loudly, but just enough for Michael to hear from behind his desk. He didn't turn. "She's not trying. She just left it there." Eliza tilted her head, puzzled. "But what if he doesn't eat it?" Michael set his pen down and glanced toward the corridor, where sunlight now reached Solace's ankles, brushing the short fur on Courage's neck, illuminating the silence stretched between them. "If he doesn't eat," he said quietly, "then at least he smelled it." And he did. Courage sniffed, lowered his nose closer to the ground, not out of hunger, but because something in that scent stirred a long dormant instinct, the ability to tell the difference between something given with a reason and something given with trust. He didn't lick, didn't touch, but his nose remained near. Very near, and Solace, though her eyes now shimmered with heat, made no move. No whisper, no coaxing, no gesture of encouragement. Because she understood. When a soul is relearning how to breathe, it must also relearn how to choose. And anyone walking beside that soul must relearn too, how not to take that choice away. The entire morning passed like a song without lyrics. Eliza came back twice. Ryan walked by. A new intern girl peeked from a distance. But no one stepped in. No one interrupted. Perhaps because they were beginning to understand, what was unfolding in that corridor did not belong to the world of commands, training, or rewards. It was something else. Deeper, slower, quieter. A realm where a single look, a twitch of a nose, a held breath could redraw emotional maps long shredded by violence and neglect. As noon approached and the light faded back, leaving a new chill across the floor, Courage pulled his head slightly back. Not out of fear, but as if he had made his choice. He didn't eat, he only smelled. Then retreated. But Solace saw it, how the distance between Courage's nose and the chicken had shortened more than any physical step could. He had moved closer, not to feed, but to test the scent of something that didn't hurt. She folded the cloth again, tucked the untouched piece of chicken inside, and laid it across her lap. "You don't have to eat today," she whispered. Not to him, but into the space between them, where something invisible had just quietly filled the void. "You just have to know," she continued, "that it will be there. When you're ready." Not eating wasn't a refusal. Smelling was a beginning. And in a world where survival had long been linked to pain, a single breath drawn close to the scent of gentleness was already a quiet resurrection. Solace didn't wish for him to eat. She only wished that he knew. He had the right to smell without being hit, pulled, or betrayed. This was the first time Courage had ever been given that right. And that was their first step. That noon unfolded as if the world had decided to slow its pace, a day of no obvious changes, yet filled with something that made the leaves behind the fence sway ever so slightly, as if following the breath of someone learning how to exist again. The wind carried the earthy scent of soil, drifted through rows of rusted kennels, and brushed against the old mesh fences like a forgotten song. Inside the rescue center, everything held still, a fragile but precious stillness. Solace remained. After folding the cloth back into her fabric pouch, she didn't leave. She kept sitting, in the same position as the past few days. The only difference was in her gaze. Not trust, not hope, but repetition, and only those who have sat beside silence long enough know repetition is the bedrock of healing. Courage did not retreat deeper into the kennel. He didn't pull his head away when their eyes met. His gaze remained cautious, still probing, but no longer evasive. Until suddenly, a sound. Not loud to an ordinary person, merely the clang of the outer gate blown open by the wind, metal meeting wall with a dry, sharp, sudden strike. But to Courage, it was not simply a sound. It was the trigger of memories imprisoned in the flesh. Everything unraveled in an instant. His body jolted violently, as though an electric current had shot through his spine. His eyes widened, his ears, which had just begun to soften, snapped upright, then flattened tightly against his skull. The air inside the kennel froze. Courage recoiled, scrambling backward into the corner as though an unseen monster had torn through the fence and was bearing down on him. He did not bark, but he panted rapidly, his body trembling, curling into the smallest shape possible, pressing himself into the icy wall of iron as though trying to vanish completely from existence. Solace didn't move. She didn't shout his name. She didn't reach out. She didn't rush to explain or comfort, because she understood. This panic wasn't born of the present. It was the uncontrolled return of a memory that Courage had never been allowed to end. His eyes found hers, not as they had that morning, but now with a look that said she, too, might be a threat. She didn't blame him. She didn't grieve. She only remained silent. And instead of stepping forward, she moved back slightly, not to leave, but to give Courage the space he needed to recover from the flood of memory that had just burst its dam. She sat, quietly, hands resting on her thighs, not closed, not open, but simply there, a gentle offering, like a silent prayer whispered not to the heavens, but to the shivering soul in front of her. You can be afraid, and I will stay. Michael came running when Eliza shouted, "Something just happened outside." He turned toward the far end of the hallway, and there, in the shadows of the kennel, he saw Courage curled in the corner, shaking violently, his eyes wild with terror, claws scraping against concrete, his frame hunched like a child abandoned in a storm with no name. Solace didn't look at him, but she shook her head, just slightly, as if to say, "This is not about a momentary scare, this is the past. And no one rewrites the past in one sitting. We can only sit and not leave." Michael said nothing, and then he stepped back. It took more than an hour before Courage stopped trembling. The faint clatter of a distant metal tray falling was enough to make him flinch again. Every sound hit him like a knock on the doors of hell, doors that had long been locked but never sealed. And for that entire hour, Solace never took her eyes off him. Not to watch, but to let him know. Something in her gaze remained. When Courage finally lifted his head, very slowly, like someone crawling from under the wreckage, he saw she was still there, exactly as she had been before the panic arrived. Her hands hadn't moved forward, but they hadn't pulled away. Her eyes hadn't turned aside, but they hadn't demanded anything either. And for the first time, Courage attempted something no one had asked of him. he exhaled. A true breath, not frantic, not rushed, but one that spoke, even after the downpour of memory, that somewhere, not everything had been washed away. Solace smiled. Just barely. And she said one thing, very softly, yet just loud enough for Courage to hear, not with his ears, but with what was left inside his battered heart. It's okay. You made it through again. There are rains that do not fall from the sky, but pour from memory. There are waves that do not rise from the sea, but surge from scars that never fully healed. And there are people, like Solace, who do not come to block the rain or silence the wind, but come simply to sit through the storm, to prove to a trembling soul that no matter how many times the rain returns, they will not disappear. The next day, Solace arrived earlier than usual. The sky had yet to fully brighten. Indigo clouds still curled around the eastern horizon, quiet as ink lines, yet to dry on a letter meant for someone who missed their train. The wind was colder than on any morning before. But still she came, not in search of results, but in belief that presence, repeated enough times, could become a familiar breath for someone who had spent a lifetime choking on silence. Michael stood behind the glass door, hands clasped behind his back, eyes following her silhouette as it disappeared down the last stretch of hallway. She didn't know he had been there, long enough to see that she'd grown thinner. Not much, just enough for a man who'd spent 15 years in rescue work to recognize the quiet signs of someone slowly being worn down by a hope not backed by visible change. He stepped out. His shoes scraped against the floor, his arm pressed heavy against the wall beside Courage's kennel. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her. Same posture, same low ponytail, still not looking at him, still staring inside the kennel at a dog who had never believed in anything called patience. "Solace," he began, voice slower than usual, like each syllable had to be brushed free of dust before being allowed to exist. "Are you sure you still want to keep going?" She didn't turn, but she heard him clearly. Michael didn't wait for a reply. He looked toward Courage, lying deep in the corner, not shaking, not panicking, but holding fast to a distance still too wide to cross. "I know you're patient. I was too. But there are some dogs," he paused, choosing his words. "There are some dogs who never come back. Not because they don't want to, but because what's broken in their minds has been broken too long. Too deep. Do you understand?" Solace nodded softly. "I do," she said, her voice light as breath fading into early cold. "I understand he might never become the kind of dog people hope for." "Then," Michael turned to face her, "why sit here every day? No one's asking you to. No one expects this. You don't have to prove anything." This time, Solace turned. Her eyes were calm, not in defiance, not in resistance, but like a mirror quietly reflecting his question back in a different shape. "I don't have to prove anything, Michael," she said. "I just need him to know that someone is still here, even if nothing happens." Michael's hand tightened around the strap on his shoulder. The wind slipped through the collar of his coat. He looked down at his feet and let out a slow breath. "How much longer?" he asked, nearly a whisper. "I'll stay here." Her voice paused. "Until he knows he doesn't have to be afraid anymore." The words didn't echo, didn't stir the air, didn't demand remembrance, but they lingered, like water seeping into wood, invisible to the eye, yet quietly altering its grain. And it did change something, in the one who heard it, and in the silent soul curled behind the steel bars. Courage didn't look at them, but his ears were no longer pressed flat. His eyes remained open, and between the man who stood and the woman who sat, he felt something unsaid. No one was forcing him. But neither, especially not her, would disappear simply because he hadn't moved. That afternoon, the rain began to fall. No thunder, no heavy winds, just a gentle drizzle, steady and hushed, like the background score of a film with no lead actor. Solace remained seated, soaked, but not cold. She didn't shield herself. She didn't move beneath the awning. She just sat there, knees tucked to her chest, arms wrapped around her shins like the body's way of creating warmth from nothing but one's own presence. Courage stayed still. But he didn't turn away, didn't bury his head in his legs. He watched her, through the rain, through the steel mesh, through layers of lingering distrust, and he didn't look away. Solace spoke, barely above a whisper, but still enough to carry, "Even if it rains, I'm still here." And for the first time, Courage didn't recoil from the sound of rain. Water seeped through the worn fabric of Solace's sweater, soaked into the cuffs of her sleeves, slid down the length of her spine. But she didn't flinch, didn't shiver, didn't lift a hand to wipe anything away. Because in that moment, she understood. Any gesture of self-protection might be misread as retreat, and she never wanted Courage, not even for a second, to feel that her presence was conditional. A leaf spiraled down, landing near the steps, twirling in the damp air like a trace of time, moving at half its pace. Inside the kennel, Courage shifted. Not with urgency, not with tension, just a small movement, as if his body was adjusting, trying to feel more clearly the presence that, even in the rain, hadn't left. And then, it happened. Not a lunge, not a step forward, not anything that could be recorded on a camera or marked as measurable progress. It was just a look. Courage, from where he lay, turned his head. And for the first time, he didn't glance. He didn't peek from the corner of his eye. He didn't steal a look when she wasn't watching. He looked straight into Solace's eyes. Just for a few seconds. But clearly. She felt it, not in her body but in the quiet places inside her trust that had long been waiting for proof that stillness had meaning. It wasn't trust. She knew. There was still fear in that gaze, still hesitation, still a barrier as thin and firm as unbroken glass. But there was also something else, something more fragile than hope. A question mark. He looked at her as if weighing, not who she was, but whether she truly was what her presence had promised to be. Whether this person, soaked, silent, undemanding, untouched, was real, or just another illusion conjured by loneliness trying to soothe itself. And that was all. A short look. A single pause. A moment briefer than a heartbeat. But to Solace, it was the first time she'd been allowed inside his thoughts. Not as someone barging in, but as someone invited to stand quietly at the doorway. She knew, with Courage, even a reaction might drive him back. He wasn't used to eye contact that came without commands, hits, or shouts. So she didn't give him anything grand. She simply nodded, very lightly, as if to say, "Thank you for looking." That afternoon, the rain stopped around 4. The sky split open in places, sunlight slipping through like threads of gold stitching up the edge of time. Solace remained seated. She didn't change clothes, didn't dry her hair. Courage, after a long stretch of stillness, rested his head on his front paws, his eyes still facing her. Nothing more happened. No second glance, no breakthrough. But that look, that single, sustained gaze, had cracked the stone wall Courage had built under the name "No one is allowed in." It wasn't trust, but it was recognition. And when a soul long broken by violence and abandonment begins to recognize another, not by scent or sound, but by looking straight into their eyes. Then even a fleeting second becomes the beginning of something profound. The realization that someone else has reached the deepest part of you, a place no one has ever been allowed to stand. The next morning, the rain was gone, but the ground remained damp, and dew clung to every bar, every crack, every blade of grass bowed low at the base of the fence. The wind was still. The air carried the musky scent of a night that hadn't fully faded. A scent both melancholy and clean, like time had paused and forgotten to move on. Solace arrived, not faster than usual, not prepared any differently than the day before. Only her eyes had changed, just slightly. They held the stillness of a lake after a storm, reflecting things most people prefer to ignore. Courage was still in his kennel. He wasn't buried deep in the corner. He wasn't looking away. He was simply waiting, not clearly for a person, not clearly for a thing, but for something unnamed. Solace sat, just as always. No new position, no shift in routine. But one thing was different. Today, she didn't open the cloth bundle right away. She waited. Courage glanced toward her hands. Not expectantly, not with anticipation, but as if, deep within, he was watching. Will today be like yesterday? And if it is, will it be safe? Solace opened the cloth nearly 15 minutes later, right as the first bird sang behind the old shed. One piece of chicken, just like the day before. Same cook, same scent. No change at all, except this time she didn't place it on the ground between them. She held it in her palm. Open, upturned, still. She didn't inch closer. She simply held, a silent offering, shaped like stillness. Time slowed, like glue sealing every breath. No one spoke. No one urged him forward. There was only courage, still lying there, then lifting his head. A simple motion, and yet, if one has lived a lifetime in the corners of darkness, they would understand that stepping away from the place you've named safety, even by just a few steps, is infinitely harder than leaping off a cliff. Courage stood. No tremble, no retreat. Step by step he moved, not fast, not slow, like someone wading through deep waters, uncertain if the ground beneath still existed or had ever been real. When he was only a few steps away from Solace, he stopped. She didn't move. Her hands remained open. Her arms didn't reach out, didn't withdraw. They simply stayed, a quiet platform for something approaching, something that didn't need to be named. Courage sniffed. His nose drew close to her hand. Once. Twice. And then he lowered his head. Gently. Slowly. And in that moment, when it seemed the entire universe was holding its breath, Courage, of his own choosing, took the piece of chicken from Solace's hand. Not snatched, not rushed. He simply held it between his teeth, then drew back. One step. He didn't flee. He didn't curl inward. He only stepped back, like someone placing down a quiet declaration in the only language he knew. I choose this. Solace said nothing. She didn't smile. She didn't reach to stroke him. Courage returned to his corner. He didn't turn his back. He simply sat, the piece of chicken still in his mouth, not eating, just holding it, as if he wanted more time to feel what he had just chosen. Michael passed by. He paused. He saw only Solace's empty hand and the glimmer of moisture in Courage's eyes. He ate it? He asked. Solace shook her head. Softly. Number, but he took it. On his own. Michael nodded, slow, deep, like someone who had seen many things fall apart and yet knew before this quiet, unremarkable act that something real had just taken place. The next day the sky was clear, as though someone had taken a silk cloth and wiped it clean. No clouds, no rain, just soft sunlight stretched across the old tiles, casting sleepy beams of a world gently stirred awake by hope. Solace entered the final hallway, her steps unchanged from the day before, but the air around her was different. Not because of her, but because the world had begun to respond. The wire door creaked shut behind her, and for the first time, there was no sharp, panicked breathing from within Kennel 6. Courage was sitting, not curled, not withdrawn, just sitting, like a sentry, listening to the morning's arrival. His ears were no longer pinned, still low, still cautious. But in that posture was something only those who have seen true fear can recognize, the difference between reflex and choice. Today, he chose not to fold his ears down. Solace sat, as always. No rush, no words. She simply turned her palms upward, letting the sunlight slip between her fingers, resting against skin weathered by the weight of waiting. Courage lifted his head. No startle, just a deliberate movement, as if he had begun to grow familiar with the woman's repetition, and for the first time found it not threatening. His gaze held hers, not long, not deep, but long enough for Solace to know. He was present in this moment, not pulled backward into the past, not locked into the instinct to flee. And then, very slowly, his ears began to rise. Not fully upright, but no longer pressed against his skull like the final armor left to him. A few staff members walked by. None of them noticed. No one saw that his sitting posture had changed, that his ears had lifted slightly, that his eyes no longer darted away. But Solace noticed. A motion so small it would be invisible to anyone else, but to her it was the shifting of a great vessel at sea, the rudder turning not with force, but by mere degrees, just enough to alter the course of everything ahead. And she said nothing. Because she understood the things that matter most in healing never arrive with noise. Michael returned to the hallway at dusk. He didn't speak. He only stood still, watching Courage's silhouette like that of a child seated at a porch, no longer hiding, no longer folded into himself. He stepped beside Solace, sat down, and only after a while he said, "His ears, they're up now." Solace nodded. Her eyes never left Courage. "It took nearly a month," she said, "just to convince his ears that the world wasn't the enemy." Michael let out a long breath, as if something heavy, carried unknowingly for too long, had just been released. "Sometimes," he murmured, "all it takes is for someone to stay long enough, and even the way a creature carries its ears will change." When Solace left, Courage didn't follow her with his gaze. But he didn't curl up either. He simply lay down, eyes open, ears tilted in her direction, not out of alertness, but as if wondering, will that set of footsteps return again tomorrow morning? That night, the sky held no moon. Darkness settled over the shelter like a thick velvet curtain, soft and impenetrable, blurring every shape, dulling every edge, until even the line between what was real and what was dream began to dissolve. Courage lay in his kennel, not stiff, not braced against the wall, not burying his face into the floor as he once had. He lay on his side, as if his body had begun to remember how it felt to sleep, like something no longer needing to flinch at every sound from the outside world. And then, in the stillness that almost passed for peace, his body began to twitch. At first it was a slight tightening in the hind leg, then the muscles along his neck pulled taut. His whole frame coiled like a rope wound too tightly, Claws scraped faintly against tile. His eyes were closed, but the lids flickered, violently. He breathed fast, sharp, like someone running through a forest with no light, no direction, a dream, but not a kind one. In that dream, there was the burnt scent of old metal, the drag of chain links across broken concrete, the heavy, rushed footsteps of someone not coming to rescue, but to intimidate. Courage, or a smaller, weaker, ragged version of him, was dragged from the corner of a dark kennel, the one that had once been his hiding place during the earliest years of life. A hand, large, rough, scarred, clamped around the back of his neck, pulling. A stick, wooden, cold, indifferent, slammed down without mercy. Once, twice. He didn't remember how many times he had screamed. Only that, at some point. He stopped. He just trembled and lay still. Because a creature that no longer fights back sometimes gets released sooner. Outside that dream, in the place where time moved as slowly as dust drifting through dim yellow light, Solace returned to the corridor. She didn't have a reason, at least not one she could explain. Only that. Her heart was not at rest. And trust doesn't only come from being there when you're asked. It comes from having the courage to return when no one is expecting you. She stopped in front of Courage's kennel. She saw him, trembling, not from wakefulness, but from being trapped in the grip of an old nightmare that hadn't loosened its hold. She opened the gate, carefully, like someone walking across a frozen lake, aware that one loud sound could shatter everything they had built together. Courage didn't wake. But her footsteps, soft as fog, caused a pause in his trembling. She didn't call his name. She didn't reach through the bars like others often did. She sat low in front of him, close enough to be present, far enough not to overwhelm. And then, after a long, deep breath, Solace reached out her hand, slowly, like a breeze, toward his shoulder, the spot least sensitive, yet nearest to his heartbeat. Her fingers touched, gently. Courage jolted. His eyes opened, confused, exhausted, wet with tears. A single tear slid down his cheek, across the edge of his face, touched his paw, and vanished. And then, without sound, without words, without a voice anyone could hear, he whispered, in the way only a being who has never learned to speak can whisper, "You are the first one who didn't hurt me." The next morning. The sun hadn't yet risen high enough to pass through the eastern fence. Dew still clung to the grass, shimmering and unshaken, as if no hand in the world had dared disturb it. The iron door moaned open, its sound long, thin, faded, like the overture of a love song never written. But something was different, right from the beginning. Courage was no longer curled in the corner. He was standing, and more importantly, he was facing the entrance. There was no joy in his eyes, no excitement, no wagging tail, just a gaze. Calm, waiting, and long enough for anyone watching to understand. He had started to measure time by the sound of someone's footsteps. Solace stood still for a moment. She didn't smile right away. She didn't rush forward. She just looked. And in that moment, all the quiet things she had carried for weeks broke open, not loudly, but in silence that falls only once in a lifetime. The moment you realize someone who once trusted nothing has begun to wait for you. She stepped forward. She didn't wipe her tears, didn't bow her head, didn't look away. Because for the first time, she, the one who always stayed, the one who had always waited, also needed to be seen. Courage didn't retreat. didn't dodge her gaze. He didn't run to her, his instincts were still intact, his wounds still healing. But he didn't flinch. And when she sat down, in the same place, the same distance, he didn't need time to remember who she was. He moved toward her. Slow, but certain. Not for the chicken in her hand, but for her presence, because it had become something he chose to move toward. Solace reached out her hand, this time not as a test, but as a habit, and Courage, softly, steadily, as if no muscle in his body carried doubt, lowered his head and pressed his cheek into her palm. Just rested it there. Like a key, returned to the only person who never asked for it. Michael passed by, and for the first time, he didn't stop. He didn't ask. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to witness more. Because he knew. Today was not for others. Today belonged to two souls, one who had waited, one who had decided not to hide anymore. Solace kept her hand still. She didn't press down. She didn't pull him closer. She let Courage decide how long was enough. And in that moment, when his cheek met the skin of her palm, not wet, not burning, not cold, just the faint warmth of something brushing through a door long closed. Something broke inside her chest. Very quietly, her heart beat, not with panic, not with fear, but with slow, resounding pulses, like a drum tapped lightly on quiet earth, just enough to remind her, I'm alive. Someone might say this woman had been brave, steady, unshakable. But only she knew, each day she sat before Courage, she too was waiting for a miracle, even the smallest one. And when that miracle came, there was no spotlight, no music swelled, just skin on skin, a back gently trembling, a breath deepening, like her body whispered back, "This is real." Courage closed his eyes, not because he had been taught to, but because he sensed, in a way no one had ever shown him, that these hands were not here to grab, not here to steer, only to hold, only to receive, only to exist like a sky, never asking anyone to fly, but always there in case someone tried. Solace's brow furrowed softly with emotion. Her hand remained, steady, unshaking. But inside her palm, right where Courage now rested, every nerve lit up, as if she too was learning for the first time how to touch someone without needing to protect herself. Courage did not move. He simply kept his head there. He didn't ask, he didn't surrender. He simply stayed. And Solace understood. This was no longer an act of allowing someone to touch. This was the quiet, sacred moment of choosing who may touch you. From within Solace, where every blood vessel seemed to hum a wordless melody, a thin line of tears slipped down her face, not hurried, not loud. And when it fell into her open palm, the very hand where Courage had rested his head, he opened his eyes. He looked at her, and in that glance was something wordless but clear. He understood that what was falling wasn't the grief of sadness, but the tear of someone who had been healed in the very same breath as the one they stayed for. A moment that could appear simple, a hand, a gently resting head, a gaze unhidden. But within that silence, something had just been named, just been born, just been returned to the place it was once torn away from. Solace remained there, long after, not because she expected anything else to happen, but because she knew. There are truths that should only be spoken when the world is quiet enough to hear them. She withdrew her hand, not abruptly, not hastily, like someone lifting their fingers from still water, careful not to disturb what had finally calmed. Courage didn't look away. And then, in a voice low, slow, not meant for the world outside, but for the river running beneath her ribs. Solace spoke. Courage is your new name. She didn't glance around. She didn't smile. She simply placed her hand upon her chest, where the heartbeat had just summoned those two simple words, carrying within them an entire journey of rebirth. Courage. Not because he had become strong, but because he had dared to be vulnerable with the one he chose to trust. From the end of the hallway came the sound of footsteps. Michael, coffee cup in hand, shoulders slightly hunched like a man who had seen too many mornings that didn't need light, stood there, paused. He didn't interrupt. He only watched the woman seated on the cold tile floor, not like a staff member, not like a rescuer, but like a quiet peace, breathing in time with the soul before her. Courage, huh? He echoed gently, his voice hoarse like morning mist, thin as a thread caught at the throat that refused to fall. Solace turned, not surprised, not guarded. She nodded, gently, the way one might place a small stone upon a grave, not to mark, but to say, I was here, and I remember. Michael nodded too, eyes catching a kind of light from within, not the kind that blinds, not the kind that demands to be named, but the kind that glows only when someone witnesses something too true not to believe. Then he said, not loud, but loud enough for the silence of the hallway to carry, maybe she was born to be Solace, and he, to find the courage that was once taken from him. She stood. Not too early, not too quickly, because she knew. A name isn't just something to call. It is an invitation. From this day forward, if you're ready to step into life, do it with this name, because it is what you've walked through, what you've reached, what you have reclaimed on your own. And that morning, as sunlight poured fully across the large window at the end of the hall, while other kennels still waited for the familiar hands that would deliver breakfast, courage rose. He stood on his own. No command, no coaxing. He stepped to the edge of his kennel, placed his front paws on the gate, lifted his head, not barking, not whining, only releasing one slow, steady breath as if testing, is my voice still something this world can hear? And from down the hall, Solace turned. Her eyes still glistened, but her lips curved into a smile, like the first light of dawn, warm enough to comfort, never harsh enough to blind. Good morning, Courage. There are names not given by paper, not called by trainers. There are names that only emerge when someone stays long enough to witness a soul step out from darkness, trembling, quiet, but rising, guided solely by the beat of their own heart. And when Solace called him Courage, it wasn't to make him braver. It was to remind him. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep walking, even when your heart has been shattered so deeply you forgot it could still beat. That morning the wind was calm, the sunlight not harsh, but something in the air felt as though it was leaning forward, like a deep breath held at the edge of release after days of silent restraint. Solace approached the kennel, no piece of chicken in hand, no need for words. She brought only her eyes, the same gaze that had been there every hour, every day, from the moment Courage turned away to the moment he dared to look back. He was still standing, paws resting atop the gate, like someone who had walked to the very threshold of a box that had once been a shelter, a prison, a place of survival, but had never been home. Solace bent slightly, her hand reaching forward, not to touch, but to grasp the lock. An old latch, a little rusted, opened by hand, no electronics, no code, as if this whole shelter had chosen to preserve something from a slower time, a time that still believed in the quiet. A soft click, small. The gate eased open, slowly, not pushed, not pulled, just as if it exhaled for the first time after months of holding breath. Courage flinched slightly, but he didn't step back. Solace said nothing. She shifted to the side, not to block, not to beckon. She understood. If life truly begins from within, then every step must come from the soul that owns it, not from encouragement, not from reward, but from the desire to walk forward by a freedom no one can give, only safeguard. 1 minute passed, then 2. Nothing happened. And then, with emotion so subtle few would notice, Courage lowered his paw from the gate. 4 paws touched the ground, neck unbowed, tail not tucked. Only the eyes, deep, quiet, held steady towards the space that opened just beyond the bars. And then, 1 step, then another. He walked, like someone relearning how to move, not across a floor, but across a fragile bridge of trust growing back from ruin. Solace lowered herself to the hallway floor, where sunlight slanted in through the small window high on the wall, casting a soft golden veil like a morning glance filled with gentleness. Courage approached, his steps even, as if his heart was learning a new rhythm after years of being strangled beneath shouts and chains. When he reached her, no bars, no locks, he didn't retreat. He didn't collapse into her. He didn't cower. He just stood, close, very close. And then, without being prompted, without being expected, he bowed his head, pressed his forehead lightly against her knee, like a silent punctuation at the end of a sentence, like a thank you that had never been taught how to speak. Solace closed her eyes. Her chest rose and fell, not from fear, not from effort, but from the overwhelming clarity that what had just happened was no longer progress. It was a crossing into a new world. He was no longer inside the kennel, and the world was no longer a place to hide from. Behind them, Michael stood quietly. His eyes, tired from hundreds of case files, from thousands of animals passing through unnoticed, now shimmered just a little. He didn't step in, didn't speak. He simply stepped back, because he understood. From the moment Courage walked out, he no longer needed rescuing. He needed walking with. And Solace, she never came to save him. She came to sit beside him until he chose to open the door on his own. When a door opens, not because it's broken down, not because it's pried apart, but because the soul inside finally feels steady enough to step forward, that moment isn't a change. It's a return to the self that had once been silenced, a return to the being who had been buried beneath survival. And when Courage stepped out, the world around him remained the same, but he had changed. And in that, the world, for him, would never look the same again. The sun outside the courtyard, where the kennels faced a rectangle of quiet grass, was soft, like a palm pressed gently to the forehead of someone who had just begun to heal. There was no wind. But there were sounds, the faint jingle of chains in a nearby kennel, the gentle scrape of claws across concrete, the wheeze of wheels on the feeding cart for the older dogs. And then, the sound of courage, not from his throat but from the pads of his feet. His first step on the brick floor outside the hallway, no applause waiting. His second, past the rusted lamppost where Solace often leaned at dusk. His third, into the light that touched fur once stripped bare, now grown back just enough to catch the sun. He paused at the low step. Just one small leap would land him in the courtyard. Solace stood behind him. She didn't touch him, didn't call him. She only placed her hand over her heart. Courage looked down at the grass, eyes wide open, legs steady, not frozen, just still, like someone asking, "Is this mine to stand on?" Then, instead of jumping, He walked down. One step, then another, and set foot on warm grass lit with sunlight, on 4 paws touching freedom, without having to pay for it. The other dogs, most of whom had never shared space with Courage, but had long scented the silence at the end of the hall, turned their heads. And at the other end of the fence, where children were sometimes allowed to play with dogs that had already learned people, stood a little girl, about 7, hair tied in 2 small pigtails, a pale yellow dress with flowers. She raised her hand, just lifted it halfway to her forehead, like a silent wave to someone who might not understand words. "I see you." Courage stopped, because the air had changed. The sounds around him, no longer warnings, had become rhythms of life. Soft, steady. For the first time, he could hear them without feeling like he didn't belong. The girl kept her hand raised. Courage didn't walk toward her, but he didn't back away either. His ears, once so folded they seemed glued down, lifted slightly. Not completely, but enough to hear the breeze. Not as a threat, but as an invitation. And his eyes, once flat like still water that reflected nothing, now flickered with something unfamiliar. Not survival, but wonder. The kind of wonder born when someone dares to believe, maybe here. "No one wants to hurt me." Solace walked toward him, slowly, not to lead, just to walk beside. Not too close, so he would know he was still choosing his path, but no longer walking it alone. He looked at her, then looked back at the little girl. And there, between eyes that watched, between sunlight that chose no favorites, between a girl who waved and a woman who never forced, Courage stood. There are footsteps that make no sound, but mark the quiet birth of something new. There are glances not aimed at a destination, but meant to tell the world, "I'm here." And there are sunlit days, without wind, without soundtrack, that still make time stop, just to witness a soul once buried in shadow step forward, stand still, and not fall back. So even the air tilts slightly to remember. The evening descended slowly. The sun didn't set. It retreated thread by thread, as if afraid that leaving too quickly would mean missing the quiet miracle unfolding in its glow. Courage lay on the porch. Solace didn't ask him to stay. She only placed a worn blanket on the cool tile, not too close, not too far. Then she sat beside him, not to watch over, but to be present, not to protect, but to share the stillness. As night came, the rescue's lights dimmed to a soft amber. Michael finished locking the shift log, stepped outside, and saw them both still sitting there. He didn't say anything, just lifted a hand in farewell, and walked away like a gatekeeper who knows when to step back from something sacred. Courage didn't fall asleep right away. He stared at his shadow cast on the wall, bent, short, then long again, like the outline of a stranger with no name. Then slowly, he turned back and walked toward her. There was no fear, no hesitation, only forward motion, as though for the first time in his life he knew with absolute clarity what he needed. Not light, not food, but a closeness just near enough to hear the breathing of someone who was breathing in time with him. Solace didn't leave, because she understood. Tonight marked something, and there are milestones in life that cannot be left unoccupied. She rested her head on her backpack, leaning against the wall. Her hand stayed lightly between herself and Courage, not inviting, not protecting, simply there to say, "If you need, I'm here." Solace closed her eyes, not to retreat, but to let Courage know she wasn't waiting for anything, She wasn't expecting a reaction. She was here because being here was the only right place to be. Courage curled up, not touching, but close. And for the first time, the very first time after a lifetime of nightmares, chains, the whip's crack, and the roar of nights without sanctuary, he laid his head down, without needing to press it against anything at all. At midnight, the wind changed direction. Leaves whispered outside the window like distant voices from an old world. Solace cracked one eye open, not because she was startled, but because someone's heartbeat beside her had just changed its rhythm. Not anxious, but deeper, like the breathing of a being who, for the first time, was drifting through sleep without having to brace against the past. Courage breathed evenly, his body loose, no flicker beneath his lids, no unconscious murmurs from a place of pain. And in the dim light of the overhead bulb, the kind of light that doesn't glare but settles gently like a lullaby without words, Solace saw it clearly. He was sleeping. Solace drifted off, too, not from exhaustion, but because, for once, she was allowed to rest. For the first time, she didn't need to keep one eye open, watching for the shiver, the twitch, the rising tide of panic. For the first time, the silence between them was proof of something immeasurable. Tonight, Courage wasn't dreaming about the nightmare. Some nights do not require good night wishes. They don't need lullabies, warm blankets, or sedatives. Some nights only need one person to stay, and one soul who once knew how to bite, who once flinched at every shift, who survived by folding into the smallest possible space, to now dare relax their shoulders, close their eyes, and breathe evenly. When a creature sleeps without retreating, the world, even within the four walls of a shelter, becomes a more livable place. The next morning, the wind slid through the corridor like a quiet courier. The sun rose softly. Not blinding, just enough to cast gentle shadows. And within the shadow of a woman and a dog, sitting together at the small stoop at the back of the shelter, something could be seen. Something hard to name. Michael appeared from the far side, file in hand, jacket over his shoulder. He walked slowly, not out of age, but out of the reverence that comes from sensing he was about to step into something sacred and fragile. "Solace," he said, his voice barely above a hush, careful not to disturb the stillness. "A family just called." She turned. Not surprised, just waiting for him to continue. "They're from the Northern Highlands. Own a farm. 2 children. Had this breed before. Lost their old dog last year." He glanced down at the file in his hands. "They saw Courage's photo on the website. They want to meet him." Solace didn't respond right away. She turned to look at Courage, sitting beside her, head held high, ears relaxed, eyes open and deep. He didn't understand the words Michael had said, but he understood Solace's face. And in a moment that would never be captured, never emphasized, there was the softest tilt of his head, not in wait for command, but in quiet readiness, for someone's heart to speak first. An hour later, the cream-colored car pulled up at the gate. The husband, broad-shouldered, carrying a folded blanket in his arms. The wife, slender, eyes bright, voice carrying that tone of someone who used to call animals by name as if calling family. The 2 children stepped out last. No rush, no shouting. They simply stood at the fence, where Courage waited beside Solace. "Hello, Courage," the mother said softly. She didn't stretch out her hand. She didn't step closer. She only smiled, as though recognizing someone who didn't need to earn trust, but simply needed to know he had been seen. Michael handed over the folder. "They meet every requirement: large property, ample space. Kids are old enough. They're committed to behavior rehabilitation. They're letting him decide." Solace still didn't reply. She sat down again, placed her hand lightly over her chest, where her heartbeat was clearest. "He already chose me," she said, not looking at anyone but Courage, "and I won't make him choose again, just because this world still has good people who aren't the ones he needs." Silence settled. Not heavy, not tense, just the kind of pause that lives between two pieces of music, where no melody is needed, only stillness. The woman smiled, nodded. The man said nothing. He simply stepped back. And the little girl, the one who had once waved with pigtails and wide eyes, stepped forward, crouching down to Courage's level. "I don't think he wants to come home with us. I think he already has one." Then she turned to Solace. "You're his home now, aren't you?" Solace pressed her lips together, nodded. A slow nod, like the last breath of an old worry finally allowed to disappear. Michael didn't try to persuade her. He didn't need to, because he understood if a dog who once lost faith could choose someone again, then that person had more than earned the right to choose back. That afternoon, the car drove away. It didn't take courage. It only carried with it an unspoken understanding, shared between people who may not raise together, but love the same. Courage lay down, his head resting across Solace's legs. She reached out, gently stroking his brow, for the first time, without her hand trembling, without fearing he might pull away. The morning broke with a clarity so strange it felt almost deliberate. The earth still held a few fine droplets of dew, like unanswered questions left quietly on the ground. Courage rose slowly, as though each vertebra was remembering how to stretch without needing to brace against the world. Solace poured water. She didn't call him. She simply placed the bowl beside the door, then sat down with her coffee, sipping in the rhythm of an old habit. Even if this journey beside him had only lasted a few weeks, Courage took a few sips. He didn't turn his head. He simply stood, then walked lightly down the narrow hallway that led toward the maintenance wing's edge. There, resting like something forgotten, like an accidental relic, leaned a long mirror against the wall, dusted with age, streaked with lines across its face. Once used to reflect kennel lighting, now nothing more than a cold surface, and yet today it had become something more powerful than any tool. Courage paused in front of it. At first, it was unclear. Was it a reflection? Or a ghost? A cautious glance. A brief exhale. Then, he tilted his head. A familiar reflex, once honed to identify threat, but now, not for defense. Now to ask a quiet question. Is the one in the mirror still me? His coat had grown thicker, smoother, no longer patchy with exposed, bruised skin. The scar behind his left ear remained, but faded, buried beneath a new layer of fur. His eyes, once sunken, once dim, now held light, clarity, and most importantly, the will to look back. No longer the gaze of retreat, no longer the hunger to vanish into shadow, but the eyes of a being who had just learned to exist is to be allowed to see oneself. Solace stood at a distance. She didn't speak, didn't step in, just stood, like an audience that knew its role was not to participate, but to witness. Because she understood, what was unfolding did not need comfort. It needed space. Courage stared a moment longer, then lifted a paw and placed it down again. Not with a jolt, but with deliberation. As if he was checking whether the image in the glass also knew how to move forward. Solace came closer, sat beside him, not to interrupt, only to arrive. "What do you see?" she whispered, expecting no answer. But Courage turned, not abruptly, not sharply, just turned, in a slow, small circle, like the way he often moved before curling into sleep, and then rested his head on her knee. Solace placed her hand gently on his shoulder. She felt the beat beneath the fur, no longer racing, no longer drowned in panic. She said nothing more. Just sat, with him, beside a mirror that didn't need to be wiped clean, didn't need to be covered. We don't look in mirrors to find out what we appear to be. We look to see whether the pieces we lost are making their way back. And when a dog, who once trembled, who once couldn't meet a gaze, who once lived entirely on instinct, dares to stand, dares to look, and does not flinch, that is not just survival. That is the rebirth of dignity. And for Courage, today wasn't just another day. Today was the day he realized he had stayed. By noon, the wind shifted. No one noticed, but Solace did. She recognized the subtle change in the scent of time itself. In the small eastern yard, once a cordoned-off space for difficult cases, once filled with growls, curled bodies, and cement floors worn smooth by restless pacing, a low white fence now framed soft grass, small wooden benches, and a box filled with nameless toys. There, Courage lay, not sleeping, not bracing, just lying, eyes open, head raised, watching the clumsy steps of a few newly arrived dogs. A small white one kept circling near him. Each time it tripped, it looked his way, then dashed off again. Courage didn't look away, yet he remained where he was, not out of hesitation, but as a quiet landmark, a still presence that told the newcomers, "Here, no one is left behind." Solace sat on the wooden bench beneath the trees, a soft leather notebook resting open across her knees. She didn't write. She simply held the pen between her fingers, as if the act of sitting there, in this courtyard where so many wounds had once found their way back to wholeness, was already enough to anchor her heart. And then, the car arrived. An old one, dust on its tires, and from it stepped a child. The girl didn't cry. She didn't search for anyone's face. She clutched a worn teddy bear tightly in her arms, head bowed, eyes vacant, the same way Courage once looked down upon his arrival, as if the ground was the only thing left that hadn't betrayed him. A staff member led her down the hallway. No one spoke, only glances passed between them, the kind exchanged between people who had once seen that same look, who understood without needing to be told. Another silent battle had just been sent to this place. Courage rose. He stepped across the wooden frame, past Solace without pausing, only flicking her a glance in passing, then moved forward, not with the fear of his old instincts, but with a new kind of knowing, one learned not from pain, but from presence. Where there is hurt is where I'm needed. The girl sat on the doorstep, still holding her bear, still looking at nothing. Courage didn't rush to her. He didn't draw close. He sat at a distance once necessary for his own survival. 1 minute, then 5. The girl glanced sideways, only slightly. Then, a tiny movement, her teddy bear loosened, shifted slightly to the side. And that was the signal. No one gave a command. No one bore witness from start to finish. Only Solace, the one who once waited months in the old hallway counting blinks like signs, now saw the moment unfold again, this time through her former pupil. Courage moved. 1 step, then another, slowly, steadily, as though he was carrying the language of every soul once forgotten, and placing it gently beside a child who didn't yet know how to speak through anything but silence. He didn't touch her. He simply lay down. Then, carefully, rested his head on the tile floor beside her feet. The girl froze. still clutching her bear. But then, through some instinct older than logic, she shifted her weight slightly closer. Then again. And finally, barely audible, a breath left her chest. A small, almost invisible exhale, escaping from lungs that had held too much for too long on a journey without clear destination. Courage remained still. His eyes blinked. Bright, but not demanding. Grounded, but not weary. As if saying, "Sit here, as long as you need." I've sat there too. There are wounds that don't need to be erased, only stitched into scars someone else can see and believe. I too can heal. And when a dog once scarred becomes a resting place for a child learning, for the first time, that the floor beneath her will not harm, that moment transcends recovery. It becomes legacy, a legacy alive, a healing that knows how to walk. Perhaps the world outside spins faster every day, footsteps racing across sidewalks, glances sliding past one another, leaving nothing behind but dust and noise. Perhaps there are days when you feel too small to change anything, too quiet to soothe a world that thrashes in chaos. But remember, a gaze that lingers gently can become a dock for a soul lost at sea. A hand that waits, not to fix, but simply to remain, can pull someone back from the edge. And a breath that doesn't race with the noise may be the one thing that keeps a frightened room from shattering. We are not required to do great things. We only need to do kind things, slowly, steadily, with conviction, the way Solace sat, day after day, until a soul named Courage dared to return to himself. And if you carry even a flicker of warmth inside, a soft glance meant for a silent child, a moment where you pause to let an old dog pass, then do not hold it back. Let it move. Because in an age that runs too fast, those who dare to keep pace with the heartbeat of stillness are the ones quietly healing a world that has forgotten how to breathe. Slow down. Let it be gentle. And then you'll see, if each of us tends to one warm rhythm, this life can become a song.